across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon. 3 minutes after 1 o'clock. Welcome to the home of Common Sense. Thank you to Alex Phillips. She's back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. What do we got in the big pot of news debate today? Keir Starmer criticising Donald Trump for calling President Zelensky a dictator and defended him as Ukraine's elected leader, despite the US president's claims that Ukraine caused the war with Russia. These are very interesting times, but there is an incredibly dangerous side to all of this. Are you Team Starmer or Team Trump? Let me just put it like that. Our lines are open. Also, the BBC has apologised for Luis Rubiales has been found guilty of kissing player Jenny Hermoso without consent after the 2023 Women's World Cup final. Where do you stand on that one? A lot to say on that as well. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk. 0344 499 1000. So we have this almost new world order, I think we could say, and Alex was alluding to it in the handover there, and at the beginning I know she talked a lot with Philip Ingram about this rather strange, what's called slightly annoying geopolitics, and what it all means, how you fit it together, the jigsaw puzzle that is planet Earth in 2025. And it's looking rather different from 2024. Europe's position changes, America's position has changed, Russia's position has changed, and of course the European continent, whether you look at it as the EU or the wider geographic continent, has also changed. And all of this has happened in about 5 minutes. I mean, it's extraordinary. People vying to have their views seen as the solidifying opinion of common sense. Others perplexed by what is being said by different leaders. Fallouts where previously there was no fallout. Divides where previously a divide did not exist. This, of course, comes after Donald Trump's words about Zelensky, the president, just still of Ukraine. Let's have a reminder then of what Mr. Trump said about Mr. Zelensky.
Modestly successful comedian, President Zelensky talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that basically couldn't be won. He refuses to have elections, is low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished? It's hard to be high. Somebody said, oh, no, his polls are good. Give me a break. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast because that war is going in the wrong direction. In the meantime, we're successfully negotiating an end to the war.
Successfully negotiating an end to the war. Now, I think what Philip Ingram said earlier, there was a tipping point here. When the Americans, when Donald Trump first started talking about this, I think we all looked and thought, this guy is going to sort this. This guy has got this in the bag, or potentially in the bag. And then there was the Saudi talks a few days ago. And even there, it was, you could kind of see what was about to happen. But it's since then that it's all sort of gone pear-shaped. Now, what Donald Trump is saying there, I don't even think the most right-wing Republican would have said in quite the same way at the tail end of last year. That has all changed. He's essentially created an enemy of Zelensky at a time when most of the world, not exclusively, Russia has its allies, of course, China being the obvious one, but he's created an enemy of a man where, I think most Western countries have had the very opposing view of that position. Mr. Zelensky is due to meet Trump's Ukrainian envoy today. The rift, of course, continues to grow. What is Donald Trump playing at? Keir Starmer, however, our own Prime Minister, has gone in the totally opposite direction to Trump. He's backed Zelensky as a democratically elected leader. He refuted the idea that Mr. Zelensky was a dictator. Sir Keir called Zelensky on Wednesday evening and told him it was perfectly reasonable for Ukraine to suspend elections during wartime, just as the United Kingdom did during World War II. Let's have a reminder then of when Mr. Starmer went to Kiev and met with Zelensky just 1 month ago. Here's what he was saying about that special relationship.
It is really important that Ukraine is put in the strongest possible position. And that's why the capability, the finance, the military support that is also being provided is ramped up, because this is the time to ensure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position as we turn into 2025. Peace through strength must be more than words, it's got to be actions. And therefore, as I say, we'll play our full part when it comes to guaranteeing Ukraine's security. But we must never lose sight of the absolute need for Ukraine to be in the strongest possible position as we go into 2025. Thank you.
That could not be more at odds with Mr. Trump's position. I mean, you could not, if you wanted an example of two completely opposing views, not nuanced opposing views, completely, unequivocally opposing views, there it is right there. We got to stand by these guys in Ukraine in military terms, in financial terms, ramp it up, keep it going, and endorse Mr. Zelensky as the main man. That could not be more at odds with Trump's position. What has changed for Trump, if anything at all? Is he playing a wider tactical game on this? Are you Team Starmer or Team Trump? 0344 499 1000. Mr. Starmer is likely to have the support of most EU countries, most European countries, with those comments, and quite a lot of other Western countries. It's interesting how this hasn't fully ingratiated natural Trump supporters either in the president's position on this. Priti Patel, somebody who you might have thought, well, if anyone's on the right of the Tory party, it's her. If anyone was going to have a sympathy with Mr. Trump, it would be her. She was having none of it either. So it's a kind of rare moment where certainly in Westminster and beyond, there is a lot of concern about Donald Trump's comments. So you heard what Starmer said. You've heard what Mr. Trump said. Where would you be on this? Team Trump or Team Starmer? 0344 499 1000. Let's get a word on this and the other big stories of the day, and there's a lot out there. Henry Hill, Deputy Editor at Conservative Home, is back with us. Henry, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
What a strange place we've arrived in, and it's strange for a number of reasons. That the specifics of Trump's position, America's new position, Starmer, the European continent, Russia, and the whole curious jigsaw of what is going on. But the speed with which this has happened. 5 minutes ago, none of this was true. Today, we're in a different world.
It is bizarre. I just have to apologise. I've got a frog in my throat that came in the last 30 minutes, so it might get a little bit...
pesky froglet. I know that.
I know. But the really strange thing is, the difficulty as a journalist is that usually we try and decode things for people, right? But I think that the problem, and I had this yesterday, is that when you do that for something like this, you end up running the risk of just making a reasonable case that Trump wasn't actually making. Because if you wanted to steel man what Trump is doing here, Zelensky and the Ukrainian government have said that they are not open to a peace settlement that involves Russia retaining Ukrainian territory. It currently occupies about a fifth of Ukraine. Now, Trump is keen to get a deal that basically at least freezes the conflict where it is along the current battle line. Zelensky has been refusing to get involved in talks, and you can see why theoretically it might be that Trump has realized that actually the biggest barrier to him getting this deal is Zelensky, and so he was trying to apply maximum pressure on the Ukrainian government. But then you look at the comments from J.D. Vance, and you see that it's actually more likely that Zelensky just irritated Trump by criticizing him in public. So it's very hard to try and tell if there is actually a grand strategy at work here. But I think, as you said in your introduction, there are a lot of people who might have been open to the idea that this war simply has to stop at some point, that we have not given Ukraine the support it would need to actually win at any point over the last 3 years. It's simply racking up a body count on both sides. That's a position. Also, there's lots of people who are sympathetic to Trump's broader point that the West has not spent enough on, that Europe has not spent enough on defense for far too long, right? But he's completely destroying that coalition behind his position with this absurd description of the Ukrainian government. Because even if you've got no sympathy at all for Zelensky, just as a straight question of fact, it is impossible to claim that he started the war.
Yeah, well, let's have a reminder of when Trump made that very specific comment.
And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way. And President Biden, in all fairness, he doesn't have a clue. What he was so bad.
He was so bad, doesn't have a clue. I mean, what's interesting about this, Henry, look, this goes over fairly obvious territory, but Trump is unconventional, and that was his attraction to the American electorate, the fact that he delivers and he thinks and speaks in very different tones, and he puts convention in the bin and shoots from the hip, and that's how he works, and that's fine. I understood all of that. I even understood the Saudi talks, even though Ukraine weren't there. I could work out maybe why he was doing that. But getting that personal, he's a dictator. He was an average comedian or whatever it was he said. He started the war. May have been a misspeak. I don't know. But either way, why does Trump have to go there? Because we don't really hear. That's the kind of way you might talk about Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, I mean, listening to the whole clip, it sounds like what he really meant was you could have finished it by now. You could have just kind of given up, right?
Yeah, I think that's true.
Right. The whole clip does put it in context.
You let it go on longer than it needed to.
Right. Given that, especially without lots and lots of American help, you could never have won it. It's still a fairly baffling thing. But, in theory, he says he could do a deal that would involve keeping nearly all the land. Now, what does that mean? Think back to before 2021, when this latest round kicked off. In 2014, Putin occupied Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, right? And you had the weird People's Republic of Donetsk and People's Republic of Luhansk. Now, it could be, maybe, because originally Putin's strategic objective was simply getting Crimea, which has a very important Russian base on it at Sevastopol, that Trump thinks he could have done a deal where basically Ukraine just gave up the territory that was occupied in 2014. Now, I don't know if that's true. Putin clearly wanted the rest of the country, right? He already had Crimea. He didn't have to invade the rest of everything. So who knows? But we'll see.
Just move this on to another point as well. I noticed Tim Montgomery, former Conservative, has criticised Reform for their silence on Trump's support for Putin. We've been bashing the phones, trying to get some comment from Reform. There is nothing forthcoming at the moment. I'm sure they will eventually. But Tim Montgomery has criticised the silence on Trump's support for Putin, urging them to condemn his attacks on Ukraine and Zelensky. Now, of course, this is perhaps delicate territory for Reform UK, Henry, given that, we know Nigel Farage has his own very positive relationship with Mr. Trump. And I think it would be reasonable to say that many of those Reform MPs, all of those Reform MPs and lots of Reform members instinctively support Trump. But they are also aware that quite a lot of right-wing voices are a bit disturbed by Trump's tone over the last couple of days. I mentioned Priti Patel in the intro, and almost every other Western leader, left or right. Is this a headache for Reform UK, do you sense, Henry?
Certainly it is for Nigel Farage, simply because, and actually, ironically, the government is in largely the same boat. So Keir Starmer has a meeting coming up with President Trump in the next few days. And so one person who has been signally very quiet on this is the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. And the reason for that is that Donald Trump takes public criticism extremely badly. And therefore, if you want to maintain that relationship with him, and we're talking about Nigel Farage has invested a lot of time in building up a personal relationship with President Trump. And given that he is now back in the White House, that does give the Reform UK leader a lot of credibility on certain issues, right? Anglo-American defense, trade, all kinds of things. Yeah. And if he were to go over the top, that might risk blowing that up. Now, it might be that he could argue, look, I can make a better case, given that I think he's been largely okay on Ukraine. He could make the case, I can make the case to Trump behind the scenes, but that means I can't do it in public. And the government can make the same case. Yeah. But the challenge in the social media world is that, frankly, diplomacy often means being polite and diplomatic to people whom a lot of people would like you to just denounce in public. And there is a real tension there between maintaining a private line of communication, which might actually do some good. Imagine if Nigel Farage could actually persuade Donald Trump to shift his position on Ukraine on the basis of that personal relationship. Yeah. There's a tension between that and the kind of performative, why haven't you done your big tweet yet, of modern politics.
Let's move to this story. Extraordinary, this. An asylum seeker who was declared a child by judges turned out to be a 23-year-old bloke with a receding hairline and a big beard. The Home Office originally decided that the Sudanese immigrant wasn't a 16-year-old, despite his claims, but this has since been overturned. It seems as if, this is Starmer's plans might well be failing. Remember, let's have a reminder, because it was going to be so simple, Henry, under Keir Starmer. He had a way around all of this. Let's have a reminder of Mr. Starmer's, I suppose, methodology on solving immigration.
You will have helped to smash the gangs, secure our borders, and save countless lives. Smash the criminal gangs, and they are criminal gangs, that are running this vile trade and putting people in the boats. Take those gangs down. I think smashing the gangs that are taking people's money is a deterrent. I think you have to smash those gangs. The only way to stop that is to smash the gangs that are running this vile trade. Smash the gangs.
There it is. Smash the gangs. Not going too well, the smash the gang thing, I think we can reasonably say, Henry. When you see stories such as this, a 23-year-old who was passed as a child by a judge, then you realise that this whole story is about much more than words and, well, smashing gangs.
Yeah, the smashing the gangs thing was always just displacement activity, right?
Correct.
Right. It was a bit like the drugs trade. As long as there are people prepared to pay thousands of pounds to try and get to this country, and the only thing you need to provide is a rubber dinghy and hide them in the back of a lorry for a bit, you'll find criminals prepared to take that up. The problem has always been that the UK is a soft target, right? We don't have ID cards. It's very easy to work in our black economy, and our courts are seemingly bending over backwards to prevent us from deporting people, right? And this is yet another example. There have always been stories like this. I don't know if it's just, I'm just noticing more of them now that Starmer's in, and the judges maybe know that he's less likely to try and crack down on them. He did have that big clash with England's most senior judge, Baroness Carr, the other day. But this is the kind of absurdity that discredits the entire system, right? It's when, Baroness Carr in that clash, she was saying the judges, all parties, all politicians, they must defend the judiciary. They must defend the judiciary's decisions, even when they disagree with them. And I'm sorry, but it's decisions like this which corrode that faith in the court system, right? And even if the government has legislated, if the courts decide that actually, and this is the problem with the human rights regime we currently have, is that they trump everything else. And so if the judge decides for whatever reason that there is some human rights ground, it trumps any legislation the government has passed to the contrary, unless the government has said so explicitly.
Indeed.
And it's going to cause it's going to cause a backlash at some point if they don't do something about it.
And it's expensive as well, because overturning the decision left the council involved with a £30,000 legal bill, and that's at the cheap end of these kind of things. Stay with us, Henry. More stories to come. The BBC apology, what happened in the world of football when a top official gave a kiss on the lips to a professional player, and NASA are in the news. Find out why in a couple of moments. This is Talk.
On what happened in the case of the market crisis of 2022, the Bank of England have since admitted it was their fault. They've admitted that 2/3 of all of that market movement was down to their failure to regulate pensions, but they were successfully blamed it on me. And as you know, Alex, we've got a very supine mainstream media in this country. They spend a lot of their time being briefed and leaked to by the permanent bureaucracy. They spend a lot of the Bank of England have since admitted it was their fault.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This one comes from Just John, who says, it's not Mr. Trump, it's President Trump, and I'm Team Trump. I think we can probably safely say it's a fairly interchangeable term, in the same way I said Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Starmer. He's not your dad, John. All right, he's a politician. Never trust any of them. That's the usual rule of thumb. We've got Henry Hill with us, deputy editor at Conservative Home, looking through the big stories of the day. Let's move to this one, Henry. It's a curious one. The BBC being forced to apologise after it came to light that they had used the son of a senior Hamas government official in their documentary to talk about ordinary Palestinians. Let's have a listen to a little clip from the programme. Ordinary kid, Henry, except that he wasn't really just an ordinary kid. His old man was one of the most senior officials in Hamas, a terrorist organisation. The BBC has now apologised for using him to front this documentary. They said they didn't really know that this was the case. It was made by an independent company, and they're now very, very sorry indeed. I think journalistically that is quite a blunder.
Yeah, and it's remarkable that it's not the kind of thing that you would think to check. Because any documentary made in an authoritarian or totalitarian country, and remember, Hamas has been running Gaza functionally as a dictatorship, you always have to have your radar set to maximum for why did the ruling party allow this film to be made? Why were these journalists given access? Who were they given access to? On what terms, right? because any one of those regimes that lets cameras in wants propaganda to come out. And we've seen the way that the international organizations, intergovernmental organizations operating in Gaza, aid organizations operating in Gaza, they've all seemed to be at risk of being subverted because they know that otherwise Hamas can simply take away their access to the people they're trying to help. So sure, it was made by an independent company. That obviously means that the BBC didn't necessarily go out to find the Gazan minister's son, but you should have had somebody at the international desk think to ask these questions when you were commissioning the thing, right? Because now you've put it out. What is in with the still globally reputation of the BBC on top of it, which is an extraordinary blunder.
And this story just broke in the last hour or so. Luis Rubiales, the football chief over there in Spain, has been found guilty of kissing Jenny Hermoso without consent. This was after the 2023 Women's World Cup. There was a bit of a hoo-ha about it at the time. People said, well, it's not a very good look. He's kissing her on the lips. He said it was a moment of jubilation. There was nothing sexual or weird about it. It's just he went for a smacker on the lips in a moment of sheer celebration. It then went from bad to worse for him. He was dragged through every kind of tribunal and court. It ended up being a proper High Court case, and he's now been fined €10,000, about £8,200, acquitted him of coercion. And his career, of course, is gone.
Yeah, I mean, just it was, I know it's Spanish, maybe there's different rules, but I mean, it was 2023, man, just don't do it at that point. The player says that it has tainted, I think that's the most important thing here, ultimately. The player that he kissed says that it has tainted one of the most sort of joyous, triumphant days of her life and her memories of it. So,
Did it really, though? I mean, we are allowed to not believe someone's position. I mean, we can't be her. We can't be her. I get that. And she's a woman and she's a man. But we, can we run away too much with that? The guy clearly, he went for a smacker on the lips. I don't think it was sexual for a start, not for 1 second, no more than it would be the amount of times we see players give each other, male players give each other a kiss on the lips when they've scored a goal.
Sure. Look, obviously you can. It's for everybody. It's for everybody to make up their own mind. True. I do think on the flip side, it can be perhaps too easy sometimes for people who have not necessarily been subject to sexual harassment or something that looks or feels a lot like sexual harassment to underestimate the effect that it can have, especially if it's somebody that you've worked with, somebody who's in technically a senior position to you in your place of work. So we should always be careful. Yeah, absolutely. There were definitely in the depths of the kind of like woke era, we were asked to believe the most outrageous stories on the basis that you should simply believe the victim at all costs, and that produced some ridiculous outcomes. Yeah. But I don't think we can go too far the other way in simply dismissing the feelings, because again, he's not been since they've not convicted him of the most serious possible offences, right?
Sexual assault and coercion, yeah.
Right. Exactly. They've basically agreed with you. They said it wasn't sexual, but it was inappropriate, and he's been fined £8,000 right now. So I think that's fairly reasonable, and we don't want to risk in the backlash against a lot of very silly excesses in past years, downplaying somebody's legitimate feeling that if they don't want to be snogged by their boss at work, sexually or otherwise, it's their right not to be.
No, I get that. And, had it been in the car park as they were just going in on the normal 9 to 5 training day, and he suddenly went, how you doing, Jenny? Smack, and gave her a big kiss on the lips, I think we'd all go, that's just weird. That's really weird. I guess in the context of jubilation and victory and all the rest of it, clearly things got carried away. We will never, ever be able to fully know what's going on in her mind or his, for that matter. But that is the final result. He's got a €10,000 fine, and I don't imagine he's ever going to work in the game of football again. Listen, Henry, we hit the clock, but thank you. Henry Hill, he is, of course, Deputy Editor over there at Conservative Home. We didn't even get onto the NASA story, but just briefly, they've reduced the likelihood of an asteroid hitting Earth from 3.1% to 1.5% after new observations. Apparently, somebody hadn't cleaned the telescope, So they got the chamois leather out, gave it a little wipe, and they went, oh God, look, it's way, way far away, ain't coming anywhere near us. So that's good news. We're not going to blow up and die. 0344 499 1000. We'll go back to the Trump story. Team Starmer, or Team Trump is the way I put this question. I know that's a slight, look, it doesn't fully define the bigger story here, but for the purposes of Trump's position on Zelensky and Ukraine and Mr. Starmer's position on Zelensky and Ukraine, it's a complete polar opposite position. Who do you side with? 0344 499 1000. This is Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This one came in from Nasher. Now, I reckon I get somebody say this about once a week. Nasher says, and he says this, completely reasonably. If you remember, there was a peace deal on the table right at the start, but Biden sent Boris to tell Zelensky to fight on. That is the moment to which Trump is referring. I have no memory of that, none whatsoever, and I can't really find many people that have. I do hear a lot of people say what Nasher said, that if you remember, there was a peace deal on the table. There's been various points when you might have said, well, they could go this way or they could go that way. But so I stand to be corrected, by the way. I'm not blaming Nasher for this, but that is certainly, somebody literally sent that yesterday with the same words. If you remember, there was a peace deal on the table. I actually would disagree with Nasher's point. I don't think that's what Trump was referring to when he said he started the war. I think he was, as we said with Henry Hill, I think what he was referring to is Zelensky could have done more to finish it, whether that's true or not. But I think that was probably what he meant. But nonetheless, he's the president of the United States, and he publicly said and didn't row back and hasn't tried to kind of clarify his words. He said he started it. And that won't be a good look for many. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has joined other Western leaders in, of course, being quite unequivocal in condemning Donald Trump for those words, calling him a dictator as well, insisting he is Ukraine's democratically elected leader. Trump has claimed Kyiv caused the war with Russia and also dismissed Zelensky as a modestly successful comedian. He's going personal. It comes as the Kremlin has branded Starmer's plans to send 30,000 peacekeeping troops to Ukraine as unacceptable. In a moment, we'll speak to Errol Morkach, who's, of course, spokesperson for Republicans overseas UK, to get an American perspective. Dan Hodges, firstly, columnist with the Daily Mail. Dan, afternoon to you. I know you've spoken a lot about this. You've had some very interesting public spats on social media, which are always very entertaining. I know you had a row with J.K. Rowling the other day. That's a whole other point.
I did.
But you did, yeah. But on this specific issue, I mean, we are in extraordinary times. And I said to Henry Hill a moment ago, I think what is interesting for me about all of this, all the pieces have moved in this game of chess, everything, Russia, the European continent, its various leaders, Starmer, Ukraine, America. That in itself is, wow, kind of interesting. Look at what's being said here. The speed with which it has happened. 5 minutes ago, none of this was on the table. Here we are now with the leader of the free world declaring that Mr. Zelensky is essentially a dictator. He's got no mandate because nobody elected him. They should have another election. And by the way, he's a moderately successful comedian. I mean, he's gone personal, right?
Yeah, he has. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, in one sense, it's appeared to move quickly. But then if anyone saw Donald Trump's comments, statements in the run-up to the election and during the election, there were a lot of people who were very, very concerned that if he won, one of the downsides of winning would be precisely this, that he would in effect shift American policy from one in which it stood alongside Ukraine and was fighting with Ukraine to one of what is, classical 1930s style appeasement. And that's exactly what happened. And we had people, obviously, Boris was one of the most high profile saying, oh, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. And Boris has also been trying all week to say, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. He supports Ukraine, really. Well, he doesn't. Quite clearly, he wants to throw Ukraine under a bus on behalf of his best mate, Vladimir Putin, who obviously he's expressed great admiration for in the past.
But isn't his position, Dan, look, no, this is crazy. This is happening on European soil. We hear almost nothing. Ursula von der Leyen would rather talk about double yellow lines being uniform across the continent rather than talk about almost anything but Ukraine, even from some of the nearest neighbours. Very little about what is going on. And yet here's America throwing billions and billions of dollars, a never-ending supply of money. And it's not even one of their nearest neighbours. In fact, the biggest story for us as Americans, he would say, is actually our relationship with Russia. That's far more important. Why are we sending all this cash over to this guy? What's the point?
Well, the point is because if you don't stand up to dictators like Putin, and if you don't stand up to Russia, we know that puts the freedom of the world at risk. And American presidents of all persuasions, in particularly Republican presidents, used to see that and recognize it and acknowledge it. And if you compare the amounts that America has spent defending Ukraine with the amount that, for example, Ronald Reagan spent in defeating the Soviet Union in the Cold War, it's peanuts. But Reagan recognized that, Republicans recognized it, Democrats recognized it, conservatives here, Labour politicians, with a few dishonourable exceptions, all recognise that if we don't stand up to Russia and we don't stand up to Russian dictators, then our freedom is at very grave risk and very grave danger. Now, there's been a consensus on that. Donald Trump, for whatever reason, I don't know whether it's personal enmity. Obviously, we've had, disproved rumours in the past about some sort of financial links between him and Putin, business interests. I don't know what it is, but what he's saying and what his policy is very clear. As I said, his policy is just complete appeasement of Putin and one of trying to force Ukraine into abject surrender, and one which I think most sort of right-minded people will oppose.
Could it not just be rather simple, though, Dan? And, he thinks Putin, is all of the things that most of us think Putin is, but, he's a big deal, militarily speaking. That's a crucial component to this wider story. So, let him have that little bit of land that he would argue was rightly his in the first place. We're never going to redraw the borders pre-2014, so let Russia have a bit of that. I'll get guarantees that Putin won't go any further. and that's the job done. Ukraine can go back to having fair and democratic elections, which he's, of course, talked about. Everybody wins. What's wrong with that?
Because it's not his land. There's no dispute here. The territorial integrity of Ukraine has been recognised globally. It's been recognised by us. It's been recognised by the United Nations. He isn't taking back land that's his. He's invading a sovereign country, and if we allow him to get away with invading this sovereign country, he will try and invade other sovereign countries. And what will also happen is other dictators around the world will also look at us, look at our response. If we let him get away with it, they will draw the conclusion that we're not interested in defending anywhere except for literally defending our own coastline. And the world will be plunged into chaos. I mean, I hear people saying, the problem isn't, our real enemy isn't Russia, it's China. China are looking at this. China are looking at how the West responds. They're looking at how the United States responds. They're looking at the rhetoric coming out from Trump. They're looking at the way, as I say, that he is throwing a key ally under the bus. And they're looking at Taiwan and they're thinking, oh, hello, we might be in with a good chance here.
And what about that point that they started it? I mean, we can sit there and analyse forever, whether that was a misspeak, whether it was referring to something else. We just had a tweet from someone saying he was talking about this moment in the beginning when there was a peace deal that Boris Johnson was told by Biden to not accept. Is there truth in that? I don't specifically. I mean, there were lots of moments and meetings, but I don't specifically remember, somebody waving a bit of paper with "peace in our time" written on it.
My understanding, I've spoken to a number of sources about this. My understanding is there were negotiations. To say there's a peace deal, there was a peace deal on the table, assumes that there was a peace deal that had been agreed, and then it hadn't. But during those negotiations, it's absolutely true, Boris Johnson did go to Zelensky and said, do not capitulate, do not surrender. If you want to carry on fighting, we will be with you and we will stand alongside you. That's absolutely right, which is part of the reason why we have a moral obligation to stand alongside Ukraine and Zelensky now. Yeah. Because we said we would be with them to the bitter end, and we have to demonstrate we are with them the bitter end and not suddenly start, tugging our forelocks and bending our knee because Donald Trump has suddenly decided he wants to become the new Neville Chamberlain.
Because you could argue there's a peace deal on the table any day if you want to capitulate, right? I mean, that would be.
There's a very simple peace deal on the table, which is Russia withdraws from the territory that's invaded. Yeah. We could have peace tomorrow.
Listen, Dan, it's always good to speak. Thank you, Dan Hodges, from the Daily Mail, columnist over there. Let's speak with Errol Moorcoach, who is a spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. I'm sure there's quite a lot in that, Errol, that you profoundly disagree with. But let me just, before we get into the details, just tell me, what does President Trump want for this? And good afternoon, by the way.
Well, good afternoon. And I think what President Trump wants above everything else is misdirection that will lead to peace. When a war has come to a point of stalemate, negotiation is the only option left. And to actually bring this awful war to an end, to culminate it, you need to look at the U.S.'s place in the world and the fact that Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, has pointed to a multipolar world order, the U.S. not being an indispensable nation. I think it's also important to realize there was a lot of people that made deals with Ukrainians that are now out of the U.S. government. The American people voted those people out, neocons like John Bolton or Victoria Nuland, people who came and made promises that they didn't have the right or ability to keep. And now you're in a situation where you could have had this peace deal potentially, and you didn't. Fast forward 3 years later, millions of dead bodies, same exact result. Russia is not defeatable on their border. They can't project power like the Americans, but you certainly can't defeat them on their own border. So now it's a question of how long do you want to do this? If you look at, in Korea, Eisenhower signed an armistice Okay, it wasn't a surrender but you know what happened? We have South Korea today. Things can get better when you look for peace. We had the extension of the war in Vietnam because of a fear of optics, an extension of the World War I because of a lack of collaboration. So Donald Trump, he's a deal maker, and he's pushing the envelope to some degree, and he's obviously making the headlines, and he's saying things that people can't quite figure out, and I think that's part of who the Donald Trump character is. But it's not at all as lost moment. It's not as though we are here to abandon Ukraine. And I've been on media all the last day, effectively hearing people call Donald Trump Neville Chamberlain. So he's Hitler, and he's Chamberlain. What an interesting ability for this man to go from the left.
I get that, and people throw those very easy sort of cheap remarks in there. But in terms of Putin, we do know a little bit more about his backstory. I mean, would you acknowledge, Errol, that Mr. Putin, President Putin, invaded a sovereign country?
Oh, absolutely. Vladimir Putin is not our friend. Russia is a barbaric aggressor, and in every shape or form, they are to be condemned. However, the fact of the matter is they also have hypersonic missiles that can hit the center of London in 5 minutes. They have fifth-generation stealth fighters, and they have a larger standing army than all of Europe combined. Yeah. So that's the reality of the situation.
So that's what Trump is doing, essentially. It's more of a security thing.
Yeah, it's more of a security thing above all else, and also it's a fact of foreign entanglements. I mean, this war can go on forever, or this war can end very quickly. And while the last gentleman was right, if Russia was to pull back, the war would end even faster. They're not going to do that. They have that leverage. They've taken the minerals, by the way, the valuable minerals mostly in the East. And on the other side, the last administration was trying to barter the mineral rights with BlackRock for the Ukrainian sovereignty. So you've had a very unfair situation for the Ukrainian people.
Yeah,
and on top of Russia emptied their prisons. They emptied, they took poor farm boys from the middle of nowhere and took them and threw them into a meat grinder. You think they care about the losses? No. Ukrainian heroes died fighting for their country, and America made promises that they couldn't keep. And now this is the result.
But what about the comments from Mr. Trump, though, that Zelensky is essentially a dictator? I mean, when you're talking, you've got two people in the room. You've got Zelensky and you've got Putin. And the one you call a dictator is Zelensky. Now, lots of people, even those on the right, the Republican right, the British right, have said, it's going a bit far, isn't it? I mean, really? Is he a dictator? He might not be. I've never thought he's a particularly smart operator. I think the world has kind of bought into this guy that wears jumpers and combat trousers and sort of romanticised his position somewhat. But nonetheless, I'm not sure he's a dictator.
Yeah, that's a tough one to defend. I think you have to, if you want a spicy take on it, consider that his first impeachment was involving Mr. Zelensky in that phone call. Donald Trump isn't probably personally a very big fan of Mr. Zelensky, and he sees him as an actor, as he sort of was. And he also, I think, is pointing towards the lack of election. Now, how do you have an election that's free and fair in that situation? It's a pretty impossible ask, but I would caution Zelensky, just as J.D. Vance said, about telling Trump that he's living in a world of Russian disinformation. Trump has very good intel, very good sources, and to go tit for tat, but honestly, I'll concede probably not the wisest move by President Trump there.
Listen, Errol, great having you on. We will speak again, I hope. Errol Moorcock, who is spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. Over to you on this one as well. Team Trump, Team Starmer. You heard the words, you know the views of both of those leaders. Where do you stand on that? 0344 499 1000, 10 to 2. This is Talk.
Well, it's very clear that Vladimir Putin started the war in Ukraine. And what needs to happen is Russia must not allow to win from the conflict that they started in the first place. But these talks were in early days, and what I'm interested to know is what actually comes out of them. My view is Putin is the aggressor in this conflict, and ultimately, if he succeeds in being rewarded for invading Ukraine, he won't stop in Ukraine.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This from Matt. It says Russia was ready to end the war and withdraw its troops in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality just a few months after the invasion began, and was refused partly because ex-PM Boris Johnson, who pressured Kyiv into continuing the fight. The leader of Ukraine's ruling party confirmed in a recent interview published on Friday, November the 24th. Well, I don't doubt that that was said, but as Dan Hodges just said, you could argue that point at any time where there was a way to get peace. But if it's not the right deal, then you're not going to agree to it. So it's not whether there was a deal on the table, it's whether the deal was acceptable to both sides. And I don't think for one second there was something that the wider world or Zelensky would have gone, yeah, that's a fair deal, because clearly for them it wasn't. And similarly, I would imagine the Russians would have done exactly the same. There's no way the Russians were just going to leg it out of all that territory, not in a million years. 0344 499 1000. Let's go to Andy in Wokingham on Zelensky and all that's going on here. What are your thoughts, Andy? Afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you for having me on.
Pleasure.
I've been listening to a lot of the opinions here, and if you're going to put my head on a chopping block and ask whether I'm in the Trump or Starmer camp, then I'd have to say that I'd opt for Donald Trump on this matter. And the reasons are sort of twofold, really. I mean, firstly, he is the first person since this conflict broke out, the first leader to actually initiate taking a grip of the whole situation. I mean, given the huge amounts of American taxpayers' money that have been paid into the coffers of the Ukrainian regime, he's got every right to turn around and now call the Ukraine out in particular and say, right, okay, where are we going with this? Now, he might have delivered this in a somewhat clumsy way yesterday, but his critics and the people who disagree are exactly the people who sit on the sidelines like a pack of hyenas in their comfy armchairs, urging this conflict to continue, the slaughter to continue, without any strategic plan whatsoever. I think Trump actually recognizes also that there can be no peace or ceasefire without taking into account, and a lot of people won't like this, the legitimate and valid security concerns that Russia has. And this certainly won't be served by, or allayed, should I say, by invitations to NATO, that talk about placing rockets and missiles on the Russian-Ukrainian border, and placing EU or British troops in, as part of a peacekeeping force. I mean, anyone who actually believes this sort of stuff is clearly deluded. And I think you have to take a very realistic sort of approach to this. We have now had this war going on for 3 years. Nobody has come out with any kind of plan other than to plough lots of money into the Ukrainian coffers. He called him a dictator. Well, he's not. Zelensky isn't a dictator. But believe me, I've got contacts in Ukraine. It's where my family came from, roughly the region on the Ukrainian-Polish borderlands. And having been there, I can quite categorically state that it is a repressive regime run by, if not in a dictatorial way, by...
But is that because they're at war? Is that the martial law thing? Zelensky says, look, this doesn't happen. You know, ordinarily it won't be like this, but we're in a war situation, so that's why the country is run as it is.
And that issue, Ian, is not disputed. Fair enough, they're in a war situation, but the people who prop Zelensky up are a powerful clique of oligarchs and also a very brutal and vicious secret police, the SBU, who are feared by the public because they drive around cities like Odessa and Lviv and press gang thousands of young men into the meat grinder. It's interesting to see, you know, when we're talking to what's your previous contributor, Mr. Hodges, who has a very sort of simplistic view of this thing. No, it's happening on the Ukrainian side. They have lost a generation of young men.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, despite the rights and wrongs of this invasion, and of course he was wrong to do it, it's a stupid thing to do, but we are where we are, and it was, you know, it wasn't without gross provocation. We now have to take this matter forward. And finally, all I'd say, Ian, is, in my opinion, you know, Russians aren't going to give this territory up. And again, to think so is self-righteous nonsense.
Correct.
What I would do if I were Trump or the West, if you really want to see an end to this conflict, is say, right, to Zelensky and his power brokers, you sign a neutrality deal whereby you promise not to or undertake to join NATO. Your independence will be guaranteed.
Yeah.
But because of realpolitik, you cannot dictate and threaten Russia with joining NATO and placing rockets and bombs on its border.
And I think that is likely to be key to everything. Andy, thank you very much indeed. By the way, Nigel Farage has just broken his silence and given his first views on Trump's comments. The Reform leader said, you should always take everything Donald Trump says seriously, but not absolutely literally. That's a good line. He says, let's be clear, Zelensky is not a dictator, but it's only right and proper that Ukrainians have a timeline for elections. We'll look at that in more detail in the next section. Our lines are open, 0344 499 1000. This is Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Yeah, good afternoon. Welcome back. It's coming up on 3 minutes after 2 o'clock here on Talk. Lots to come in this hour. We are talking, of course, about Starmer and Trump. Mr. Starmer criticising Mr. Trump for calling Zelensky a dictator, defending him as Ukraine's elected leader, despite the US president's claims that Ukraine caused the war with Russia. We'll have more on that throughout the course of the programme. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage has just broken his silence and given his views on his friend Donald Trump's attacks on the Ukrainian president, saying you should always take everything Donald Trump says seriously, but not absolutely literally. I think that's actually a really good line, and maybe does define exactly where we're at with Trump's interventions. And an asylum seeker who was on the who the Home Office decided is at least 23 years old, turned out to be, they originally declared him as a child by judges. The Home Office has decided he's at least 23 years old and has a receding hairline as well as a big old beard. So I'm telling you now, I mean, looks do count for something, right? He's not a kid, he's a man. We'll have more on that story as well. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk. We'll come back to your calls. Gary says Trump is playing a blinder. It's all win-win for him. If he can put together a peace deal that Zelensky signs, that's the war over, and he can boast that he saved hundreds of billions of dollars for US and European taxpayers, plus millions of lives. That's the real reason he doesn't want European leaders involved. He doesn't want to share the credit for that peace deal. If, on the other hand, Trump doesn't get a deal, it gives him the excuse that he needs to walk away from the whole situation, leaving it to Europe to sort out, saving tens, if not ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars for US taxpayers, and forcing Europe to rapidly increase defence spending, which is what he wanted all along. Plus, it will now have to be done at such a pace that they will inevitably have to resort to buying US equipment. In addition, by appearing to side with Putin, he is irritating European leaders, trapping them into making promises of support to Zelensky that they know they are in no position to keep. I guarantee you these European leaders who are publicly boasting they'll stand shoulder to shoulder with Zelensky, come what may, are privately, desperately praying that he signs a peace deal. That's a great analysis, Gary, and there might be some drama in that analysis, but I think broadly speaking there's something in that, because I've long and hard over the last couple of days trying to work out how much of a tactician Trump is on international matters. Look, he's a businessman. So if he was flogging some real estate in New York, that whole area that he knew so well, he knew every which way to get a deal. He knew the very sentences you might have to utter, the wire that you've got to take a deal to, even if it looks like you're going to lose it. There's nothing that would get past Trump and Trump Senior in that world, because it's what they did and they were the best at doing it. So I absolutely have no truck in understanding there's a wider political motive here. I do think Trump hopes for some luck as well as his own judgment, but we'll watch with interest. Let's get a word from Callum Price, Director of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs and former Special Advisor. Afternoon to you, Callum. Good to have you with us.
Good afternoon.
We've been asking that question, are people Team Trump or Team Starmer? We were playing a little clip of Starmer when he was in Kyiv last month, and it's unequivocal stuff. We stand behind this man, we stand behind this country, and everything that is needed should be given to them, whether that is military, whether that is money. Fair and square, we are wholesale bought into the Team Ukraine department, said Mr. Starmer, and every other European leader as well. It could not be more at odds with the recent words of Donald Trump. Who's right?
Well, frankly, the people on the side of Ukraine and Zelensky are right. Trump has made some fairly ridiculous, frankly, and factually incorrect arguments about Zelensky and about Ukraine. It's quite hard to start a war when you're the one being invaded, first and foremost. And Zelensky isn't a dictator, clearly. He's democratically elected, as our Prime Minister has pointed out. But what's interesting here, as you've just spoke about, is what is sort of Trump trying to do, and I don't pretend to be a foreign policy expert, never mind in the head of Donald Trump, but I think it is fair to assume that there's some form of strategy at play here, and what that strategy is the trickier question, though. Is it as he says, and we hope it is, to sort of get some form of peace, hopefully. But his remarks about Ukraine and about Zelensky are potentially doing two other things, and two other arguments I've seen are that either he is trying to basically cover his own back so that if these peace talks don't go well, then he can say, well, look, I did everything else, and he can apportion the blame to somebody else, namely Zelensky. Or he's maybe trying to play a macro, bigger geopolitical game by trying to potentially bring Russia further out of the orbit of China and towards the US, and drive a bit of a wedge between there and cozy up to Russia a little bit, with that being the end goal. There are multiple factors at play here. We don't really know what is going on, but I think what we should all be clear on is that the inaccuracies in what Trump has said about who was at fault for this war, and everybody, including Farage now, as you've mentioned, have been fairly unequivocal on that. But the wider strategy is a different question.
Yeah. It's interesting, talking to Farage, in the last half an hour, he's broken his silence. And the reason that is a salient sentence, he's broken his silence, of course, because everybody knows Mr. Farage has a personal relationship with Donald Trump. And so naturally, there was a lot of eyes on the Reform UK leader to see what he was going to say. And there was, some concern. Tim Montgomery and others quite concerned why nothing had been said. What's Reform's line on this? This is a party that unequivocally would find more kinship and synergy with Trump than any other, and yet they'd said nothing at all. Well, it's been clarified. Mr. Farage has come out and said one of the most I suppose major points is you should always take everything Donald Trump says seriously, but not absolutely literally. I thought that was a very well-considered line. It covers a multitude of things there. He says, let's be clear, Zelensky is not a dictator, but it's only right and proper that Ukrainians have a timeline for elections. There's some real diplomacy there, I think, in that response.
Yes, and he's had plenty of time to consider it. Although, in his defence, he did say he was flying, so maybe that excuses him for the delay. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a good line. First of all, that you should take what he says seriously, but not necessarily literally. A lot of people around Trump are doing a bit of a clean-up job. Sort of allies of Trump saying that he isn't a dictator, Zelensky isn't a dictator, etc., etc. But yes, a fairly diplomatic role, arguably, from Farage, and he's come out and said there should be a timeline for elections in the country, which is a bit of a dividing line between his response and others. But yeah, it's right that Farage is known to have a personal relationship with Trump. Reform have certainly been courting in previous months donations from key Trump allies, including Elon Musk. So there are parallels, I guess, between the role that Farage is playing in that trying to keep Trump on side for his own party political gains, and the role that Starmer has to play in trying to keep Trump on side for geopolitical outcomes. And Starmer's statement wasn't perhaps as unequivocally anti-Trump, shall we say, as it would have been if he was leader of the opposition, that's for sure. But that's because there was a role emerging for Starmer and the UK to play as not just a peacekeeper between Russia and Ukraine, but almost between Trump and Zelensky, and sort of trying to translate one's views to the other, and forge a way through. And Starmer's going to the US next week to try and do that.
Well, on that point, Callum, and what's that going to look like? Starmer turning up with, this sort of idea, and he's already made the statements publicly. We stand squarely with Zelensky, etc. Very much at odds to what Trump said, even if we allow for the Farage line that, take him seriously, but not literally. Trump, he's got thick skin. He won't give a hoot about Keir Starmer. I mean, this could be, tricky, almost desperately embarrassing scenario for Mr. Trump, because you can almost see Trump for Mr. Starmer, you can almost see Trump in the White House telling him off. I can see that playing out. I mean, it may not, but you wouldn't be surprised if it did, put it that way. Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. And I think that's probably why Starmer's statement hasn't been as unequivocally pro-Zelensky, and he hasn't quite come out and condemned Trump's comments. He's made some pointed remarks in the statement, because they know who they're dealing with. I thought actually a really interesting insight into how this is working on the state side was what the Vice President J.D. Vance said in response to Zelensky criticising, and part of the tit for tat criticising Trump back. J.D. Vance said, this isn't the way to deal with Trump. This isn't productive. Criticising him on the world stage in public, you're not going to get a result. It's just going to push Trump in the opposite direction. So Starmer's clearly registers that and is taking a different tact and will probably try to appeal to Trump's deal making abilities and tendencies, and also do a bit of sort of behind the closed doors diplomacy to get the result that we all want, which is an end to the war. But yeah, because if he comes out swinging for Trump, he could. You're absolutely right. That could end up in a big political power show that Trump will inevitably win.
Back to reform. Ownership of Reform UK has been handed to its members. This was a statement from the chairman, Zia Youssef. Of course, there have been some, I don't want to say controversy because it was never hidden, but there was the fact that Mr Farage owned Reform UK as a business was always a bone of contention for some members. We spoke to a former councillor just last week who, said that not only is this a problem, but it means you can never unseat the leader, for example. Not that he necessarily wanted to, but in a democracy you should be able to. Mr Youssef has said, we're pleased to announce that, as promised, Nigel Farage has handed over ownership of Reform UK to its members. Reform UK is now a non-profit with no shareholders, limited by guarantee. We're assembling the governing board in line with the Constitution. This was an important step in professionalising the party. We'll soon have more exciting announcements about Reform UK as we prepare for government, he said. Now, help me out here, Callum. This is a territory you probably know best. I can't work out whether that means that Reform UK is just like any other party, the Tories, Labour, Lib Dems, etc., or whether it's just something different to what it was but not the same as the rest, if that makes sense.
Yes, as I understand it, this is steps in the right direction to become a sort of formal, normal, if you like, political party, away from what it was, which was basically an organisation run by Nigel Farage to initially be the Brexit Party, then turn into Reform UK as basically a campaign organisation, and it's now going through the process of becoming a formalised political organisation which has it baked into its constitution and its existence, democratisation, power to the members, ability to remove leaders, and so forth. It's not. As I understand it, it doesn't do all of that just yet, but this is what you have to do first before you go to those other places. And this speaks to the job and the challenge that Reform have in front of them. They've done an excellent job so far, however, whichever way you look at it, in terms of garnering political support. But what they are ultimately fighting against is a political establishment, established political parties in Labour and the Conservatives, as well as the Lib Dems. And they have established sort of groundings in institutions across the country. They've been around for hundreds of years. They've got memberships, they've got associations, they've got all of that already. And they also that also applies to arguably the policy side as well, which is somewhere where Reform need to improve. So this is what they have to fight. This is what they are up against, and they need to get their ducks in a row as quick as possible to become a serious organisation if they are going to be, as they are talking about being, the party of government. It's easier said than done, but it's something that has to happen, and this is the first steps towards that.
Indeed. And finally, Jonathan Reynolds, we talked about this a little bit yesterday. The business secretary removes that false claim on LinkedIn that he was a solicitor. This is after the Solicitors Regulation Authority contacted him last month to correct the fact and told him to stop claiming that he was a solicitor when he wasn't a solicitor. I mean, I think this is, it's an error as big and possibly even bigger than the Rachel Reeves one.
Well, yeah, it is almost in law. I mean, it's a criminal offence to say you are a solicitor when you're not. Yep. That's why the SRA exists. I worked at the Ministry of Justice for a while. I know how seriously lawyers and solicitors take this sort of thing, and quite rightly too. I mean, there's a really important caveat that before we get too carried away, in that the SRA have said they're not going to pursue this any further. And I think that's basically because what they are there to do is to stop pretend solicitors actually practicing law. If Reynolds was trying to sort of sell his soliciting services, then that would be seriously bad news. But he's basically said, I was a solicitor when he hadn't actually finished his training, in the sort of bio on his website and on LinkedIn and that sort of thing. So it's very much not a good thing, but it's not quite the level of criminal offence that it perhaps could be. Yeah. But I think the wider point here is it's viewed in the context of Rachel Reeves's CV inflation as well, but actually more importantly, the job that they're doing. If Reynolds was doing his job properly, business confidence wouldn't be at its lowest in a decade. Fair point. They wouldn't be raising taxes on business that are going to make it almost impossible to hire and fire new people, and raising taxes and raising regulations on them as well through the Employment Rights Bill. So if those things were going well, and if businesses were saying this is great, we've got a business secretary who's behind us and a government who's behind us, and the economy is going to be growing, and we're going to create more jobs, and we're going to invest in the economy, then these sorts of things would slide by. The opposite is true, unfortunately.
Yeah, there it is. Callum, thank you. Callum Price, Director of Communications at the IEA and a former Special Advisor to Government. Thank you to him. More comment from you. Gina on Trump says, Team Trump, for the world needs a shake-up. We must fight for democracy. Trump is our last chance to save our Western culture and values. David says, one thing this shows is how terrible and out of touch the UK and the EU are when they have to negotiate, particularly on the world stage. Both Trump and Vance keep showing them up, says David in the Cotswold. They're certainly doing that. 0344 499 1000.
Russian army can do nothing with Ukrainians, despite they're bigger than we, despite that they have more weapons, and so on, so on. They can do nothing. They have lost minimum 300,000 people being killed in Ukraine. Can you imagine? 300,000 killed, not less than 600,000 injured. That's absolutely dramatic losses for Russia, but they don't want to stop because they don't care about their losses. And yes, now they will put all their energy inside Ukraine, try to destroy Ukraine from inside.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This is from Gary, who says, I say let's just hold back until the US negotiators actually put down the basis of peace. Until then, I'm Team Trump. Starmer is out of his depth. Although, in fairness, I mean, he's the British Prime Minister. Whether we don't rate him very much is a completely irrelevant matter. I mean, that is sort of he's supposed to have a position on this, and that is his position. It's the one that the last Conservative government had consistently. In fact, I think you could reasonably argue, probably leading the way on endorsement for Ukraine. Sue is down in London. Sue, what are you thinking? Hi.
Hi there.
Hello.
Well, I think Starmer has a complete gall saying that he's going to send in our army. How dare he say that when he can't even defend our own coastline? We have no money left because the last government and this one has given it all away to illegals, squandered it to third world countries, ridiculous diversity issues, and that Dan Hodges said we have a moral obligation to Ukraine. We have a moral obligation to protect our own people.
What about the argument that, you know, if you run a country, you've got to wear a dozen hats? So, yes, you're absolutely spot on, but also stuff that goes on the continent of Europe will always be part and parcel of what we have to also consider.
Well, Europe have no money either.
Everyone's skint, it seems. Everyone's run out of cash.
Skint. And I can see points Trump of view. Why should America put forward all of the money when we're doing nothing whatsoever? Nothing at all. And they need to find some way of stopping this war. It can't go on and on. Don't forget that Biden's money was all tied up with Ukraine corruption. Millions was there, so they wanted to keep it going.
It's interesting, isn't it, that when you put it in terms of, you know, whose war is it, or whose responsibility is it from other countries to have a robust say on this? You know, America has been putting in God knows how much cash in comparison to Ukraine's very nearest neighbours. So he has a point. Trump has a point on that. You know, why are we fighting this battle if the very continent on where it's happening is doing nowhere near as much as us? I mean, that is a fairly reasonable point.
I think it's a huge point. Zelensky's running around in his black jeans and his T-shirt with loads and loads and loads of money. There's so much corruption there that we shouldn't be giving away all our money there. Spend it on our own people.
There it is, Sue. Thank you very much. Sue in London, Nigel in Portsmouth. What do you got, Nigel? Afternoon.
Hello, Ian. Good to talk to you as always.
You too.
I think there are, when you look at the options, there aren't actually many options. So I know Trump, some of the things he says are factually incorrect. A lot of things he says are factually incorrect. But I say that there's no bigger fan of Trump than I am. However, the options are Putin withdraws complete with his tail between his legs. That's never going to happen. The other option is we keep pumping money into Ukraine. It doesn't matter how much money and resources we pump into Ukraine, they are never going to win militarily. The other option is we pull all support from Ukraine and Putin just marches basically to the Polish border. Or the fourth option is peace and compromise. Now, sometimes to make peace, as remember the Good Friday Agreement, Tony Blair?
Yep.
There were a lot of things in that a lot of people, including me, really didn't like. But he was right and I was wrong. He was right. Massive compromises. Terrorists walk free, murderers walk free on all sides of that kind of conflict.
Some got places in government afterwards.
Exactly right. So what I don't understand is, for the last 3 years, why has no one been talking about peace? No one. Not a single politician, apart from maybe Macron very early on. All we want to do is keep the war going, throwing more money. Ukraine aren't going to beat Russia militarily. They're just not. And I think Trump is right. This can't go on. Yeah. When he says millions have died, millions haven't died, but tens of thousands have died. It's been going for 3 years, Ian. 3 years. How many more years does it have to go for? And when I hear comparisons, I really like Julia Hartley-Brewer, but when I hear her talking about appeasement, when Hitler basically walked into Czechoslovakia, nothing was done. No help was sent. However, we have pumped billions and billions, money we haven't got, arms we haven't got. And it's not just us, it's France. Because us and France are the sort of military powers in Europe. We have given them loads of resources and cash, money with no one's asking, where is this money going? America, it's not their war. They're pumping billions into it. So instead of the West pointing at Putin and saying, isn't he bad, isn't he bad, isn't he bad, how about getting him around the table and say, what is it going to take to stop this? Zelensky just saying, I want the Crimea back, I want everything back. That's never going to happen. It won't happen this year, next year, it won't happen in 10 years' time. So they need to make peace, whatever, and it will be compromised.
Yeah.
I'll tell you now what it will be. He'll keep the Crimea. He'll keep. I think he's got something like 20% of the Donbass. Much of it is ethnic Russian anyway. And Zelensky and the West, there's nothing that justifies Putin invading. Nothing. However, they were poking him with a stick. Zelensky particularly. I'm not saying, Zelensky caused the war. He did not.
But the big debate that has been wrestled with, I suppose, Boris Johnson and other leaders, past and present, is, the message that will send out is if you invade another country, it does, at least in part, work, because you end up retaining the land.
Okay, well, we invaded Iraq. We invaded Afghanistan. I mean, when it comes to invading...
But not with a view to retain the land.
Well, anyway, unfortunately, that's how borders... If you look at the map of the world and look at the borders, that's unfortunately how it was made. You think the French borders as they are were always the same, the Spanish borders...
No, I get it. I mean, things do change, and they change for unconventional reasons. And sometimes, as you said at the beginning, Nigel, they're not that attractive reasons. But, time will tell, I guess.
I have yet heard a better option than Trump, because the other options I'm hearing, as I spelled out, are more war, more death, more destruction. So the choice is that or an uncomfortable peace. Tony, and I'm not really a fan of Blair at all, but his Good Friday Agreement is kind of it's a testament to what can be done if the will is there for peace, and you're happy to make some incredibly uncomfortable compromises. And at the end, if you remember, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness
became best
shared
mates.
An office, and they were called the Chuckle Brothers because they were always laughing and joking.
And they absolutely hated each other for all those years. Yeah, I mean, that's a cracking example. Whether Zelensky and Putin end up sharing an office, being called the Chuckle Brothers or Cannon and Ball, remains to be seen. Nigel, thank you very much indeed. It is extraordinary. I mean, Nigel is quite right. If you look at it through the prism of history, that is what happens. You have a dirty old war that lasts years and sometimes decades, and then results in the very people that were enemies sitting around a table, and at some point there is a sort of a concession, and you make a statement and everybody gets on, and you think, well, why did we have all the other bit first? Couldn't we have done that to begin with? For whatever reason, I wish I could explain it. You kind of can't, because it would never have happened to begin with. In fact, they tried it to begin with. They had a row and then they had a war. So it didn't work. So they had to have the war in order to sit down and have a chat. It's perverse and it's upside down. It's completely off its head in terms of logic. Is that the way it has to end? Is that the only way it can end? I think the one thing that is true, though, and everybody must acknowledge this, and I think reading between the lines of quite a lot of comments we've had through who are sort of pro-Trump, nobody can dispute that Donald Trump has got this thing back on the table. He's got it moving, he's got people talking, he's forcing people to consider positions with a level of urgency that they have never had to do for 3 years. And that has to be welcomed. And so, yeah, it's unconventional. It's a bit weird. Some people see Donald Trump as a bit of a nutter and others see him as a bit of a messiah. Whichever side you take on that, we should all agree that he has firmly put this back on the table. Literally, no doubt about that. And the unconventional nature of the way that he imparts what he wants, what he's looking for, what he thinks should happen, by any standards, come on, it's a bit of a welcome break, isn't it, from some of the old guff we hear from parliamentarians, politicians, presidents and prime ministers, the 4 Ps, all singing from a pre-written hymn sheet that's been concocted by a bunch of spads to be touchy-feely and avoid any tricky language. Someone coming out and telling it like it is, both the president and his vice president, is a breath of fresh air, frankly. 0344 499 1000. We're back with more from you in a couple of moments. Thank you to Nigel. Great call, by the way. Lots to get through in this section. And, of course, it is a big chance to find out how you could win £25,000.
It's competition time, and we're giving you a chance to win a whopping £25,000. So what do you need to do to get involved? all you have to do is text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post. It's as simple as that. Once again, to get involved, just text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post.
18 plus, UK excluding NI. Enter by SMS for £2 plus one standard network charge by 11 p.m. on March the 3rd, 2025. Or send your name, email and contact number to £25,000 cash competition, PO Box 3190, Colchester CO2 8GP, to arrive by 5 p.m. on March the 6th, 2025. This is a News Broadcasting Network promotion. Full terms and conditions at talksport.com.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
We've got some James Bond news, by the way. James, I was only talking to a mate about this yesterday. James Bond film franchise will no longer be controlled by the Broccoli film dynasty, Cubby and Barbara, I think. That's been moved. Amazon now have gained the creative rights to the Bond franchise. So there it is. Who's going to be the next James Bond? It'll be made by Amazon. I mean, the bloke from Doctor Who's looking for a gig, so maybe, I don't know, just saying, step into those shoes, because that would be very effective. Just gone, 2:30. Lots to get through here, including that story as we've just been talking about Trump and... it's not really Trump v Starmer, of course, but Starmer's position and Trump's position couldn't be any more different. Extraordinary polarisation of views on Ukraine and its leader, etc. We've been waiting for the last couple of days for Nigel Farage's view on this, his thoughts. Mr Farage, as we know, has a personal relationship with Donald Trump. He's broken his silence now. I thought he came up with some very considered line. I know he's had a little while to think about it. You should always take what Donald Trump says seriously, but not absolutely literally. And that rather does address some of those perhaps more contentious comments that Mr Trump has made about Zelensky. Let's get a word on this and some other international stories as well. Isabel Oakeshott is Talk's international editor. Isabel, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Well, I think this was a really important moment for Nigel Farage, and quite a tricky one diplomatically, because of course he values the relationship most highly that he has with Donald Trump, and Nigel Farage knows that every word that he utters in response to what Mr. Trump said will be poured over, and attempts made to suggest that there's a rift between them, or one is that Farage is in some way rounding on his ally. And so I think it's understandable that he didn't want to rush to comment, because after all, these are incredibly complex issues. And what he's come out and said is very sensible, isn't it? That you must take Donald Trump seriously, whoever you are, but not always totally literally. And, Trump does shoot from the hip. The comments are often a bit exaggerated, saying that millions have died unnecessarily. Well, it isn't millions. Yeah. It's far too many. Don't want any unnecessary deaths, but it's not millions. Mr. Farage has said that Zelensky is not a dictator. And many critics of today pointed out that elections are generally suspended in countries that are facing an existential crisis. And certainly we in the UK can hardly get on our high horse about that one. After all, this government has been suspending elections, hasn't it?
That's a very good point, actually. Yeah, election suspension is not exclusively in the domain of Ukraine. I think we could reasonably say. I mean, in terms of sort of Trump's wider view, I was just making the point before you came on, Isabel, that whether somebody loves or hates Trump, I mean, the one thing he does is shake stuff up, and sometimes you need that, and also to feed into that point, you often need a sort of almost an unconventional back route back into the story, as it were, because very worthy people in Congress and parliaments all over Europe and the wider world have had this debate. Zelensky's pitched up at all of those parliaments. He's made statements in all of them as well. And great, but no one's got any further to solving it. And once in a while, somebody says, you know what, I'm going to do this a little differently. And it might just work.
Well, that's right. I mean, in the end, no one wants the killing to continue. That's the bottom line. We can all agree that this can't and must not go on. And the idea that it should just be perpetuated with European countries and America continuing to just about give Ukraine enough to keep the Russian menace at bay for the next 10 years is unthinkable. So in a sense, what Trump's trying to do is say, look, there are no angels here. And I think I can agree with that in terms of Zelensky. Yes, he's been portrayed so widely as this tremendous hero. And some aspects of what he's done certainly look very brave. But this is not an angel. And I think that's what Trump's trying to convey in his usual inimitable style, that this is not a binary case of, one side appalling and the other side totally innocent, which is not to say, and indeed I think Mr. Farage has acknowledged this, I think he has, that somehow Ukraine is responsible. Russia started this war. No ifs or buts about that. Russia started this war. So in a sense, what it comes down to is Trump is trying to get a peace deal. And, the niceties of that will have to be worked out by the parties themselves. But we can at least all agree that things can't go on as they are.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the any public statements pan out when Starmer visits Trump next week. I think it's going to be a rather perhaps awkward moment visually, if nothing else, Definitely. To see Starmer and Trump sitting there in the Oval Office pressing the flesh. And you can almost hear Trump saying, he's a nice guy, this Mr. Starmer, but he's wrong on everything. I can almost hear those words.
Yeah, I think that there's another point here, that what this shows is the perils of becoming totally dependent on other nations for your security. And, Ukraine has basically been left dangling because there's a change of regime in America, and Trump's got bad history here. He has history in terms of what he holds Biden administration responsible for. He thinks that, the previous Ukrainian regimes have been up to no good. And so therefore, the current administration, Zelensky, has suddenly found himself plunged into freezing water, whereas previously he was sort of, just about staggering along above ground. Now he's had this tremendous shock, and that is what happens if you don't invest in your own defences and you are completely beholden to others. And I'm not suggesting that Ukraine perhaps realistically could have ever had armed forces to match Putin's, not least because there's just endless people in Russia that Putin is prepared to sacrifice. But there's a lesson for us, I think, in the UK here. Let's not be too dependent on others. Let's not run our armed forces down to the bare bones, because you never know when war finds you.
Give us a word, if you can, Isabel, on your take as regards Reform UK's announcement from the chairman, Zia Youssef, about the change in how the party is structured. He said in a statement, we're pleased to announce that, as promised, Nigel Farage has handed over ownership of Reform UK to its members. It's now a non-profit, no shareholders, limited by guarantee setup. We're assembling the governing board in line with the Constitution. The bit that I couldn't quite work out from that, I couldn't quite extrapolate from that statement. Obviously, this is something that Nigel had talked about a lot. You know, there was a point when he essentially was the owner, I think I'm right in saying, for want of a better phrase, of the party as a business or as a company. That's no longer the case. Does this take Reform UK to the same status as any other party, or is it a kind of hybrid or something different?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I mean, I've always thought this is a bit of a red herring, but people have felt very strongly about it. I mean, again, the idea, I think you said there that it had been emphasised that it takes it from the status of a business to something else or not for profit. No one ever made a profit out of running a small political party. Yeah. Trust me, the precise opposite happened. So, you know, I used to see comments from people saying, oh, you know, Farage and Tice, they own all the shares, they're coining it in. Nothing could be further from the truth. You know, you only lose large sums of money if you're trying to create a new political movement from nothing. So this isn't as if Mr. Farage has taken some kind of, you know, business opportunity hit here, and neither has the other shareholders, such as they were. Richard Tice owned a significant portion of the shares, but all that ever was a liability, frankly. Yeah. What this does do is give the members, those who sign up, a little bit of a, well, let me not understate it, it gives them a stake in the party. And I think that's important psychologically, because previously people were sort of saying, well, it's just like having a subscription to something. You know, where's our power? Do we get to have a say in policy? Do we get to vote on the leadership and so on? And that stuff's important. You know, Reform isn't run as if it's some kind of, you know, Amazon subscription. This is a movement that they're building, and people want to have a stake in it, rightly so.
Final story here, Isabel. The asylum seeker who was declared as a child by UK judges, despite, as it turns out, he was a 23-year-old bloke with receding hairline and a beard. I mean, good Lord. How many more of these kind of cases do we have to see before someone shakes the system up a little bit here? I don't know what the judge saw or the judges saw, but clearly declaring this person a child was wildly inaccurate. It just wasn't true.
People are so fed up of hearing this stuff, aren't they? You know, we are being absolutely taken for a ride with these judgments. And I think every week there's been one or two, sometimes more than that, judgments that are so contrary to the national interest and seem to run counter to all common sense, which, of course, here on Talk is what we specialise in. I really think there's a debate to be had now about our judges and how they're appointed, because this cannot go on. These judges are continually doing things that undermine the national interest. And so either the judges have to change or the law has to change. Which is it going to be?
Which is it going to be? Listen, Isabel, thank you. Isabel Oakeshott, Talk's international editor, with us on the programme. More comment coming in from you. Alan in Herefordshire says, we're coming up to 80 years since VE Day in Europe. 80 years later, America and Russia are deciding peace in Europe. 80 years later, Europe is still reliant on America for security. Europe has learnt nothing in that time. Latest statement from Donald Trump about Zelensky has to be the biggest backstab in American foreign policy. European nations seriously need to pull their finger out and step up defence spending and their own security, as this shows America's interest is elsewhere in the world. If Putin succeeds with Ukraine, it will expose NATO and Europe's weaknesses in dealing with a crisis like this, which will send dangerous messages that Europe, NATO and the US are not the unified defence organisation they claim to be. It's absolutely going to do that. Europe might well claim in defence. I was just trying to think of what the counter would be to Alan's point there, that actually Europe didn't start the war with Ukraine. Russia did. It's Russia and others that haven't learned anything. Europe were hoping to hold peace and keep things tickety-boo. A very naive position, frankly. It doesn't take into account the unpredictability, the capricious nature, if you like, of geopolitics in any shape or form. And it also doesn't take into account what a new regime in a country like America might bring, in the same way we'd have our eye on the ball if there was a new regime in China. But this current one in the States under Donald Trump is going to be very different. There's no messing here. And the very real sense domestically for the United States, of course, was that they were losing their mojo. They'd completely lost the room internationally and were nothing more than a kind of an hors d'oeuvre in the grander scale of dominance, with China being the ever-growing, increasingly dominant nation of planet Earth. Trump is out to stop that. And if that means giving, Russia a little bit of credibility into the pot to bolster Mr. Trump's position and save America a good few quid. There's so many tentacles to this. It's absolutely vast. But you can see all of this going on, the big chess game that is the geopolitical situation and how it's panning out from the Oval Office and beyond. 0344 499 1000. Are you Team Starmer or Team Trump? I know that ordinarily wouldn't be what we're talking here. You'd be talking about, I don't know, maybe Team Trump versus Team Zelensky, or Zelensky versus Putin. But we know on record that our own Prime Minister just a month ago was in Ukraine, side by side with Zelensky, talking about how we must continue and up the pressure of support for Ukraine in military terms and in financial terms. 4 weeks later, you hear the American president say the very opposite to all of that. They could not be in more different places if they tried. So which one is right of those two? It's interesting just to explore that question. We'll have more calls from you on the way. 0344 499 1000. Coming up on 10 to 3. Voice of Doom is on its way. Day 3, I think it is, or is it day 4? Coming next on Talk.
Russian army can do nothing with Ukrainians, despite they're bigger than we, despite that they have more weapons, and so on, so on. They can do nothing. They have lost minimum 300,000 people being killed in Ukraine. Can you imagine? 300,000 killed, not less than 600,000 injured. That's absolutely dramatic losses for Russia, but they don't want to stop because they don't care about their losses. And yes, now they will put all their energy inside Ukraine, try to destroy Ukraine from inside.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
If you're hanging on, don't go away. You will be on. Mark with you in a second. Mark's in Swansea. Voice of Doom, firstly. I think it's day 3 of this. Remember, this is the political mystery voice bit. So politician or somebody connected to politics in some way. Very simple. You've got to identify the voice. Have a listen.
and see something different.
Who is that? Don't phone in, there is no prize, but you can message in if you fancy having a crack at this. Here it is again.
And see something different.
Any ideas? 87222. 87222. One more time.
And see something different.
If we get a right answer, we'll reveal all on the other side of the news. If you get a right answer in with the next 10 or 15 minutes. If not, it rolls over to tomorrow for day 4. Here it is one more time.
And see something different.
Oh, come on, you know who that is. Is it female or male or American, Australian, British? I don't know. Who is that? 0344. No, don't call. 87222. You can message in on that number alone. Back to your calls. Mark's in Swansea on Trump and co. Mark, what have you got for us?
This all goes back. You've always got to remember that Biden was never meant to be president. Right? It was meant to be 2 terms of Obama, 2 terms of Hillary, and then Trump got in the way.
Yep.
And I think complicit in this was while Biden was vice president, part of the deal was you fill your boots, son, and get out of the way for Hillary under Obama. So with Burisma and all the other millions of pounds that they swilled out of Ukraine, but then Joe Biden became president. But then the coin flipped then because Zelensky had got the goods on the Biden crime family and leveraged that to the maximum.
Yeah.
And, don't tell me out of all the billions that have gone over there, bear in mind the country is about as corrupt as they come, that they all haven't swilled out their 20%.
I asked this question objectively, Mark. Is the term Biden crime family, it's got this great Netflix show, does that maybe slightly overstate the fact for having a bit of a wayward son?
Not a wayward son. The Senate committee have already found something like 27 million that have gone through various shell companies. That is true. I mean, there's a lot of questions. Indeed, there's more questions than there are answers at the moment. That is absolutely true. But whether Joe Biden himself is connected to that? Well, the rest of his family did, and he's all of a sudden got 3 or 4 massive mansions that nobody can explain where he got the money from in his...
Well, he's been a rich guy for a long time, Biden has. I heard somebody say that about Boris Johnson. How did Boris Johnson afford a new house when he only earned 140,000? Because he was a multi-millionaire before he entered politics, I guess.
Oh, well, he's always been in politics, Joe Biden has, hasn't he? He's never...
he has, yeah. But, I mean, you can earn a lot more than just being a senator.
Okay, well, it's all legit then.
But well, no, I don't think it necessarily is, Mark. But I do wonder whether it's a very easy answer. I'm certainly not defending Joe Biden, and the fact that he became president is extraordinary, frankly, by anybody's standards. If the Democrats want to investigate the demise of their own party, then start with him. I mean, there's many characters you could throw into that picture. Do you think, in terms of where Trump is today, then, that he's certainly upped his game, hasn't he, from the last time he was president? I mean, this is because he's not going to stand again because he can't. Do you sense then that this is a not last chance saloon moment, but he's doing things at such an accelerated level for that reason, that he's trying to catch up on the 4 years he felt he missed out on?
I think so. I think he knows the game now. I think he had lots of people in there before that were working against him, a bit like the blob, the civil service that we've got over here. And now he's street smart now on what to do, and he's surrounded himself by good people that are going to crack on with what he wants. And as president, if he wants it, he's chief exec, and away to go.
There it is, Mark. Thank you. Great call. Mark in Swansea. The Biden crime family. I mean, there is a lot in there, by the way. Whether Sleepy Joe is part of it all. I mean, his son's got a whole load of questions to answer in so many respects. But I think he's been pardoned, hasn't he, from any kind of ag. Kenny in Edinburgh says, Trump is a president, not a politician. It's politicians that have caused what has happened to Europe today. Give me Trump ahead of career politicians any day. Good point. Andrew in Lancashire. Andrew, how are you doing?
Not so bad. I think Trump is a crap pot, first class one myself.
Do you think Trump is?
100%, 100%, mate.
Okay, yeah, but I mean, sometimes crackpots are geniuses as well.
Let's go back to Ukraine. Oh, mate, what he does, I call Ukraine. They've been doing the fighting. They've been doing the dying, mate, for the West.
Yes.
You know, the only English guys who died over are the freedom fighters or the mercenaries who wanted to go over. All the Americans, all the others, they've had a choice. None of the British Armed Forces have been involved in this yet. All the American forces, all none of NATO, they stood back.
Well, a lot of our money went in, though, right?
Well, you know, at the end of the day, what's not more important, people's lives or money? That's your question. If you've got 150,000 British Armed Forces, well, we haven't got that. Would you rather pay the money or see the troops dead? That's your question. So I'd rather pay the money. For me, they're doing the fighting, they're doing the dying for the West.
And Donald Trump's going to stop it.
Well, is he going to stop it? You know, I hope we do back. I hope we do back Zelensky. I really do, to the hill.
So Trump won't be an idiot if he stops it anymore, in your view, Andrew, based on your own analysis that you're looking for peace. If Trump is the man that delivers it, you will be the first to shake his hand.
Let me ask you this a question: why are those people in Ukraine fighting? Because they don't want their kids to speak Russian. That's one of the reasons why. They don't want to be taken over by a communist country.
Yeah, and the country, according to Trump, won't be taken over.
Well, do we know this? Well, Russia next year, let's have a go somewhere else, Moldova. Let's have a do. Give them 3 years to
Well, there is the danger. But, of course, if Trump is able to secure assurances, and you can argue, well, you know, what's an assurance worth from President Putin? But if he's able to do that, and it's very public and written, you know, large on the global stage, then Trump could be the man that gets the peace in the country that you want to see peace.
Right, Trump's going to be there 4 years. Putin's been there the last 20 years. Him in China's been there the last 25 years. Him in North Korea's been there the 25 years. There's going to be another.
What if Trump gets peace, though, Andrew?
Well, if it happens, mate, it happens. But it's what the cost is.
But he won't be so much of an idiot then, right?
Well, I think he is an idiot, first class.
That's fine. I mean, you're allowed to think that, and that politicians, that should be our default position of all politicians to begin with until we're taught otherwise. I get it. But if he's good to his word and solves the problem, based on your own desires of what you want to see, which is what most of us want to see, is peace, then you would shake his hand and say, well done, Donald.
Would you like to live under Russian rule in this country?
No, I don't want to live under Russian rule, but according to the Americans, they won't have to.
Well, you know, let's look at Hong Kong. Let's go back to there then. What China's done there. They said they're going to do this and that. It's under China.
It's under China indeed. On that point, Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Alan says, watching all the political classes come out to slam Donald Trump's efforts when most can't tell you what a woman is. What a joke. 650,000 Ukrainian men dispersed over the EU that could be fighting. Yet our boys are the ones to be sacrificed. Zelensky has a 4% approval rating in his own country, and peace talks are now a dirty word. As Ian would say, man alive. Alan, thank you for that. Lots to come in the next section. We'll talk about the BBC as well. What the hell have they been up to with their latest documentary? 0344 499 1000. Let's get the news at 3.
the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon. Yeah, just gone 2 minutes after 3 o'clock right here on Talk, the home of common sense. What are we talking about here? Keir Starmer has criticised Donald Trump for calling President Zelensky a dictator and defended him as Ukraine's elected leader. This is despite the US president's claim that Ukraine caused the war with Russia. Extraordinary times. Your response on that? Are you Team Starmer or Team Trump? Also this afternoon, the BBC has apologised for jackets and reflective strips designed to keep cyclists and pedestrians safe can actually make them invisible to modern car safety systems, according to a new study. No idea how that blunder happened. We'll have more on that as well in this hour. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk, 0344 499 1000. Now, just before the news, we had the voice of doom. This is the political mystery voice bit. This is the voice that we played you.
And see something different.
Who is that? These are some of the wrong answers. Kamala Harris, no. Kellyanne Conway, it is not. Joanna Shields, Stella Creasy, no. Donald Trump, no. Caroline Leavitt, no. Jacinda Ardern, no. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, no. Sarah Palin, it is not. But, yeah, we didn't get a winner. No one has got it right. Let's have a listen to the voice again.
And see something different.
That rolls over to tomorrow about 2:45. You can take part again if you know who that is. Now, the BBC has eventually apologised after the licence fee-funded corporation aired a documentary featuring what can only be described as Hamas propaganda. The film Gaza, How to Survive in a War Zone, depicts the lives of 4 boys in Gaza during the war with Israel. But they failed to disclose that one of the film's protagonists, a 13-year-old called Abdullah, was actually the son of a very senior Hamas official. The son of a terrorist, essentially. The broadcaster says it had not been informed of the connection by the documentary's producers. Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, says she'll talk to the BBC and emphasise the importance of getting it right in its coverage over the Gaza conflict. In a moment, Gary Mond, chair of the National Jewish Assembly. First, Rebecca Ryan is with us from Defund the BBC. Rebecca, good afternoon to you. I mean, look, when it comes to journalistic blunders, I am absolutely struggling to see how much worse it could be than this. I mean, this is frankly, a howler. It's about as bad as you could get when making a documentary on a very sensitive issue that you do not mention anywhere within it that the kid fronting the documentary is actually the son of a terrorist.
It's absolutely awful, and it's actually really distasteful, isn't it? With this on a day where we're seeing, coffins containing babies being returned from to their families. It's really upsetting. And for the BBC to say we weren't informed, well, so much for, as you say, journalistic excellence, which is what we're supposed to be guaranteed as part of the sort of contract between the British people and the BBC. Is they are meant to deliver journalistic excellence. So there is absolutely no excuse for this. And worse yet, it's still on BBC iPlayer. I checked just before coming on, and it is still on there. And it's an absolute outrage. And this has only been uncovered by a freelance journalist, David Collier, who's done amazing work to bring this to light and push the BBC into this half apology. And it actually turns out it's likely that some of the other children featured in it are also in a similar situation where they are that their parents are in Hamas. So it's just an outrage that British taxpayers' money is being spent on this. This propaganda, it is propaganda for Hamas, and that meanwhile we have the Jewish community in Britain feeling extremely uncomfortable on a day when we're seeing the awful scenes where those coffins are being returned and the kind of activities that are going on there. It's outrageous.
It's also, look, if this was independent producers, that still doesn't get them out of jail. In fact, in many respects, it makes it so much worse because, you are, if you are harvesting this stuff out to another company to make it, or the producers are not necessarily strictly members of staff, then your need to double check becomes all the more greater, I would suggest. And in a case like this, if you watch that documentary, set that against the normal pictures we see of Gaza, which is a bomb site, and I'm not suggesting it looks great over there in these pictures, but I think any reasonable person, and remember, if your job is just to check this kind of stuff, it's not like you're the janitor normally and you've been asked to have a look at a film and see what you think of it. Specific job as senior executives at the BBC is to check this stuff. The first thing you would have said journalistically is, wow, that's amazing access they've got there. That's incredible that they were able to film, and what, nobody was shooting at them? That's amazing. How has this happened? You'd want to know a little bit more about how they got that access. You'd want to know the full backstory of the protagonists involved, including the young 13-year-old. I mean, you've only got to hear this kid speak. I mean, he's like a posh kid. He's a, and it's great. He's a, very fluent, bilingual kid. He went to a British school in that country. He's very good at the job. I'm not disputing the abilities of that, but it's not Britain's Got Talent. We're not judging him on that. We just want to know how he got there, for goodness sake. To not be able to ask those questions is almost unforgivable. But I bet you one thing, Rebecca, no heads will roll on this.
Absolutely. Like we say, the programme is still up on iPlayer as we speak, which is an outrage. But the thing is with the BBC, they've been shown time and again to be biased on this situation, which is really problematic. At the beginning of this most recent sort of section in battle that's ongoing between Israel and Palestine, essentially, is that, they made false reports, didn't they, about the hospital bombing, and that created real issues. And they've been shown throughout this to have bad sources that are biased and to make reports that, they refuse to even name Hamas as a terrorist group. And there was a news report out only a couple of days ago where they talked about the bodies of the two youngest people being held by Hamas. They were talking about babies, but they refused to use the words, and they didn't call, even in that report from 2 days ago, they didn't call Hamas a terrorist organisation.
No. And I think they failed to point out that there was no equivalence between an Israeli hostage and a Hamas prisoner, essentially referring to them both as hostages on either side. This is outrageous stuff. It's a terrible look, and it clearly feeds into the credibility of the state-funded broadcaster. And the reason I emphasise that is because that's what's key to this, right? It's, we are funding this stuff. If this was some independent bloke on YouTube, they can make whatever video they like. That's free speech, even if it is inaccurate. But this is the BBC. They have an obligation to be accurate.
Absolutely. And as I said, this is in the contract between the BBC and the British people, which allows them to tax us essentially for watching any live broadcast TV, regardless of which channel it's from. And in that agreement, in that charter, it says that they will deliver journalistic excellence. And they've fallen down time and time again on this issue. And they've shown themselves to be biased. And it's really dangerous. And it's making a lot of people in different communities across the country uncomfortable, as well as the fact that all British people who have a TV licence are being forced to pay for this. So absolutely, I think that there should be, the half-hearted apology that we've had, a non-apology, is not sufficient, and people heads have to roll for this. And certainly, the documentary should be taken down immediately.
Yeah. Rebecca, thank you. Rebecca Ryan from Defund the BBC with us on the programme. Let's speak to Gary Mond, Chair of the National Jewish Assembly. Afternoon to you, Gary. I think Rebecca, very reasonably pointed out a bit of a catalogue of blunders in this area of bias. Jeremy Bowen's name would naturally creep into that conversation. I mentioned this incredible equivalence they tried to draw between hostages and prisoners who'd committed terrible, terrible crimes. And then this, which is, this is schoolboy era territory. Which might well be their only defence, because this is so bad. I almost want to say it goes beyond bias. It goes into another territory of utter stupidity, breathtaking ineptitude, and a massive question mark over their ability to be a broadcaster.
But this is the typical behaviour of the BBC going back since the 7th of October 2023. What they do is allow a series of lies, misreportings, and essentially downright anti-Israel bias to go all the way around the world, and then they issue a half-hearted apology. It's classic BBC behaviour. We saw that case last year with regard to the bombing of a hospital in Gaza. It turned out it wasn't the Israeli Air Force who'd done it. It turned out it was a misfired rocket from Gaza, from Hamas.
Yep.
You see this repeated behaviour, and no, heads are not going to roll. I don't believe so for a moment.
Which is extraordinary, because something as delicate as this as well, you know, it's not as if you, I don't know, pronounce the name of a town wrong in northern France when talking about wine importation. This is so serious, and it matters so much. If you're making a documentary, How to Survive a War Zone, featuring 4 young boys, and one of them at least turns out to be the son of a senior Hamas official, essentially a terrorist, and you fail to mention that. I mean, if they'd mentioned it, that would still be weird, by the way, but not even mention it at all, because apparently they didn't know.
Well, this brings us to an additional very important point, which is that all of the damage done in Gaza is the fault of Hamas. If Hamas had not attacked Israel on the 7th of October, and murdered, mutilated, raped and tortured, was it 1,500 people then, and taken 250 people hostage then, none of this would have happened. This war can be brought to a swift end, and at any time since the 7th of October 2023, it could have been brought to a swift end by Hamas releasing the hostages. So any damage, any deaths, any destruction in Gaza, it must be laid at the door of Hamas and not Israel. And that's a fundamental point for anyone who actually does see the video. Who is responsible? The answer is Hamas, and possibly by extension, the whole of the Gazan people, because so many of them do support Hamas.
Strong words. Gary, thank you for your time, sir. Appreciate that. Gary Mond, Chair of the National Jewish Assembly, with us on the programme. Thank you to him. 0344 499 1000. More comment coming in from you as well on Trump, Zelensky, Starmer, Putin, etc. Alan says, watching all the political class come out to slam Donald Trump's efforts when most can't tell you what I think I read that. Can't tell you what a woman is. What a joke. It's a very good point. Simon in Devon says, great calls this afternoon, apart from Dan Hodges, whose answer is will ultimately result in Russian hyper missiles destroying London and WW3 happening. He says, John says, can I ask, has your station been taken over by the Russian government? Are you the new RT? How very dare you? Are we the new RT? Are we the new RT? Vlad, are we the new RT? I've got to say what? Ow! Sorry. It's got electrocuted. No, we're not, is the answer. Let's go to your calls. Charlie, East Sussex. How you doing, Charlie?
Well, I was okay, Ian, but this BBC thing it's just flipped me over the edge. How much money is our country wasting on stuff that we don't want it spent on? And then I'm enjoying your show, and the BBC are doing this, spending yet more money. No oversight whatsoever. And I'm sorry, I said to your researcher, it's just tipped me over the edge this afternoon. Where's it all going to end? What on earth is all going? It's all going wrong, and I just can't. It's really, really tough for the normal person in the street to get their head around what's going on. You've got Trump, you've got Starmer, and now to compound it, the BB.
Are we? See, this is the sort of thing that keeps me awake at night, Charlie. I try to work out whether we are living in this kind of, horrendous, confusing, upside-down, labyrinthine world of nonsense and hassle and unfathomable decisions and weirdness, or whether we've always lived in that world. It's just that now we have multiple ways of accessing our news and comment and opinion. Has it always been there, or is this just like a social media 24-hour news thing?
Look, I think there's always been a level of it there, and we always have not been aware. It's always been the political classes, the very, very wealthy corporations, people like that have always known what's going on. But now, people like me who are trying to earn a living, listening to the radio, we now have access to all this information, and everyone's thinking, really? That's happening? We're spending the money on that.
Yeah.
This guy said, we're everybody's so connected now, Ian, and I think it's got to the point where how we're not all going bonkers.
I think some of us are.
I'm going bonkers.
Do you think, though, Charlie, that, I mean, you just said we've got access to all this information. We've also got a lot of access to misinformation as well. And, we know what that looks like, and we know how that can spread like wildfire. And even if it's not misinformation, exaggeration, stuff that's not given context. So to find the truth, and, I do this for a living, and we sometimes struggle. I see a story in the morning, I see somebody post something on social media, I think, wow, that's an interesting part of this story. I sit there and spend 15 minutes double, triple checking it, emailing some people. Answer comes back, no, it's completely made up. There's no truth in it at all. So we've got that going on as well.
We have, but when you say, what is the truth? Your truth may be different to my truth. It's all from what perspective we're looking at it, isn't it? So what I feel is true may be different to you, may be different to my wife or whoever. So when you're looking at you, and it's very, very difficult to pull out the bits that you think, actually, yeah, that's correct, because the falsehoods out there are also seeming correct to the layperson.
100%. 100%. And like a lot of these things, sometimes the falsehood carries a kernel of truth with it, right? So there's a little bit that kind of invites you in to go, oh, right, OK, so that bit's right. So maybe, and then you sort of work it out from there. And then you discover that it's not true. It's definitely upside down. Charlie, it's a great call. Starting on the BBC there, they have messed up. And this is where our money goes, right? 0344 499 1000. That is where you will find us. We'll do some more comment on that in just a couple of moments. I'm being told by Vlad, so we'll do that. Before we do, though, time to find out how you could be in with a chance to win, are you ready for this, £25,000.
It's competition time, and we're giving you a chance to win a whopping £25,000. So what do you need to do to get involved? All you have to do is text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post. It's as simple as that. Once again, to get involved, just text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post.
18 plus, UK excluding NI. Enter by SMS for £2 plus one standard network charge by 11 p.m. on March the 3rd, 2025. Or send your name, email and contact number to £25,000 cash competition, PO Box 3190, Colchester CO2 8GP, to arrive by 5 p.m. on March the 6th, 2025. This is a News Broadcasting Network promotion. Full terms and conditions at talksport.com.
It is ridiculous for any democratic politicians or even citizens to discuss any words of Vladimir Putin about democracy and elections. Vladimir Zelensky is a legitimate president of Ukraine. Myself is a legitimate member of the parliament of Ukraine. We have 1 million people in the Ukrainian army. We have 7 million internal replaced persons. We have not less than 5 million adults in Europe. How you can conduct elections, meaning democratic elections?
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This one comes in from Sean, who says, I think it's very simple regarding the BBC and all the rest of it. When the hard-working public have money and living well, it's OK. When we're all skint, we start to take notice of all the public spending, waste of money. That's very true. And I was thinking this last night as I was watching... I don't get a chance to watch a lot of TV at all, really. There's a couple of Netflix things, Isn't It Always, or Disney or Amazon, whatever, that I've kind of got into in the last couple of weeks. And I can't think of the last time I saw that. I think EastEnders are doing a live episode tonight, you know, which they do every now and again because it's been 40 years since it. Didn't Anita Dobson pitch up or something last night? Didn't Angie? But also, I bet is it Lofty? He was in there, wasn't he? All those characters. And it occurred to me that what the BBC used to have to do was not like, when you go through Netflix, we've all done it. You go through and every now and again you stumble on a stinker and it's not good, but it all looks just as glitzy on the advertising. You know, America's most notorious murder. Nobody knows who killed the Chihuahua in Wyoming. And, you know, a big mystery. You think, wow, this is going to be amazing. And you start thinking, do I do a second episode? And it's not that good. And there's a lot of misses in there. You know, if you actually work it out, probably the output of Netflix has got 10% of really good things on. But it doesn't matter. It's a choice, right? You buy into it or you don't. If I don't want it anymore, I disconnect my membership. The BBC have got to hit that button, the thumbs up, almost every time, to varying degrees. Not everything will be to everyone's liking, but they've got to do that more or less all the time. Not occasionally, not once in a while. Oh, look, here's Strictly. That seems rather successful. A format we've sold around the world. Doctor Who, not the current Doctor Who, but before it went a bit weird. You know, that kind of stuff. It's got to be good all the time. But it isn't. And I can't think of a good reason why I'd go, right, that's the BBC, let's watch that. It's not there. The call is not there as it used to be. Let's go to Georgina down in London on Mr. Trump. We're back to that again, Georgina. What are your thoughts? Hello.
Well, I am definitely a Team Trump girl, as you probably know. What an absolute liberty for Starmer to criticise Trump before the upcoming meeting in the US. It's looking like, to me, increasingly like Starmer's on some kind of sabotage mission to totally destroy relations between the UK and America.
Well, he hasn't criticised Trump directly. He said
indirectly.
He doesn't believe he's a dictator.
Indirect dig, you know. I mean, he's got some room to talk. He's cancelled local elections in May in some parts of the country, but that's another topic.
Very true.
America may have broken promises to Ukraine during the Biden administration, but people have got to start to realise that there's a new sheriff in town, and this sheriff gets results. There's no winners in war. Hundreds and thousands of people have been slaughtered on both sides in this war, and it's abhorrent. Trump's doing everything in his power to try and negotiate a peace treaty between Russia and the UK, as well as trying to solve the problems in Gaza. Talk about multitasking. Let this man do his job. In my opinion, he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize.
Should we not wait until he's solved it before we do that?
Listen, he is going to solve it. I have got every confidence in that man. He doesn't talk turkey. This guy gets things done.
Yeah. It will be argued by his critics that he will never be the person that solves it. That'll be other people. He just steps in as the big sheriff and starts shouting a lot and then walks away and lets the others deal with it. I think that's fair enough, by the way. You need somebody internationally when this much is at stake to be the dominant, almost the alpha male in the room.
He's not. He doesn't want to be all things to all men, unlike some political leaders.
That's a very good point.
He just wants to get the job done. You know. So
can you imagine? Can you imagine Hillary Clinton?
Oh, I don't want to
getting
imagine
anywhere near this stage. And I know Trump's done it unconventionally. I get it's not his. It's not everybody's cup of tea in the language he uses, and many of you on his own side are not enamoured by that. But if you get it done or you at least get the ball rolling. If it takes an unconventional, different kind of approach, then so what? I mean, if they solve the peace, if they got peace and solved the problem and stopped the war, and it meant that Trump had to call a president a couple of hurty names, so what?
I say give this guy the credit he deserves. If he found a cure for cancer, if he found a cure for cancer, Ian, he'd still criticise him. He is going to do it. I'm 100% sure. He works for his people as well as trying to solve problems elsewhere. Keir Starmer needs to do the same thing. He needs to work for us instead of jetting over to the United States, trying to sort out other people's problems. There's a massive problems here in the UK that he needs to sort out, and they're accumulating. It's a new one every day. Every day is a different Dodge. Indeed. I feel like I live in Dodge City, It is just not good.
It's a funny old time. Listen, Georgina, the exasperation is beautiful, frankly, I mean that in the best possible way. Thank you. Georgina down in London. Michael in Norfolk says, Ian, this country is heading into Wonderland. Rachel Reeves is Alice. Keir Starmer, the Mad Hatter. Angela Rayner, the Queen of Hearts. Does feel a bit like that, doesn't it? This from Sean. I think it's very simple regarding the BBC. When the hard-working... Oh, I did read that one, didn't I? Yeah, we notice it. We notice the shortcomings when money is tight. That's when we start to look around and go, wow, they are wasting money on that. Paul in Fife says, we keep hearing there are thousands of media people in Gaza reporting on the conflict. Reporters, journalists, film crews. Given that we were told Gaza is a demolition site, where do they stay? Where do they get their food? That's a very good point, isn't it? In war zone territory, where do they stay? This one in from Ben in Plymouth. The BBC probably knew he was a terrorist son and thought they could just hoodwink their few remaining viewers with this awful propaganda. The BBC are dinosaurs, soon to be extinct in the coming decades. And Howard in Suffolk says it's quite simple. Stop watching the bloody BBC. And that might be one way to deal with it. And it's very hard. I say this consistently. Even if you were once a supporter of the BBC. Do you know when I was a supporter of the BBC? When there was only the BBC, along with ITV and stuff. And as multi-channel TV began to take hold, I mean, the case for defending the BBC became pretty much obsolete. I mean, you can only defend it romantically. You can't defend it in any other way. You can only say, I like the idea that there is a state-funded broadcaster. I think it's a safe place to be in a world of troubled media and alleged bias and all the rest of it. Then that's why it's more important than ever. I've heard people say that more important than ever to have the BBC. Because there's a plethora of choice out there and that choice is confusing. And what is wrong with everybody chipping in, like we do with the NHS, but we do it with broadcasting because that brings happiness to lots of people who don't want to pay for Netflix or Disney or can't pay for that. You can make that romantic argument. You can't make the one about, at the beginning of the comment I made there, that actually, we need impartial broadcasters when the BBC make blunders like this. I mean, this is a genuinely proper journalistic howler. That would be criticised in the commercial sector as well, by the way. Heads would roll. If I'd gone and made a documentary and come back and said, I've got this great guy who's going to front... It's a new quiz show, I don't know, and it's headed by this guy, and he turned out to be the leader of a terrorist group, and I hadn't checked it. I think I might be in trouble for that. Just double-checking, triple-checking your facts. Everything you read on social media, double-check, triple-check, email someone, and then phone someone if you have to. because you won't know the truth otherwise. The BBC should have done just that. 0344 499 1000. Why are high-vis jackets in the news? Very important, quite disturbing, alarming even story, particularly if you're a pedestrian or a cyclist. We'll tell you more about that after this on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
As we speak, JD Vance is addressing a Conservative conference, CPAC in the US. We'll bring you any big lines from that, which is completely possible. There will be some lines. Have you ever seen a vice president have so much prominence? I know it's early doors in this administration, but there's clearly a plan afoot here. This is the guy that, if all goes well for the Trump administration, will be the next president of the United States. And at the moment, he's hoovering up a ton of headlines, whether you like the guy or not. I mean, he's absolutely... I can't recall ever seeing a vice president have their briefings or visits anywhere covered so consistently by mainstream media. Now, this story, I did allude to this. A study has suggested automatic emergency braking systems in modern cars might be essentially blind to high-vis jackets and reflective strips. The technology is fitted to all new cars, but researchers in the US say that cars they've tested failed to stop when they were driven at a mannequin that was wearing a reflective item of clothing. Let's speak with David Bailey, Professor of Business Economics at the Birmingham Business School, written extensively on the auto industry area. And I think you've been driving, David, EVs for a long time yourself.
Yes, I have.
You know a bit about the technology of cars and the progression of cars. I was really surprised to hear this. I mean, that seems like a huge schoolboy error when they were testing. What, they didn't do the high-vis test?
Yeah, it sounds like it, doesn't it? So this technology, autonomous emergency braking, is compulsory on new cars. It has been in the UK and European Union since 2022. It does save lives, so overall it's a good thing. But clearly...
Sorry, can you just interject? Can you explain what it actually does?
Okay, so essentially if something is going on and you don't see it, and you might crash, or you've always got thinking time, and the faster you go, the further you will travel. So this essentially cuts out the thinking time, and it will apply the brakes to stop you crashing into something. Okay, so it's a good thing. It's probably the biggest improvement in road safety since the seatbelt, right? Okay. So good thing. But clearly something has gone badly wrong for some manufacturers if they can't detect high-vis jackets. It doesn't seem to be all of them. So that interesting study that you're referring to, some cars perform better than others. And certainly, at the very least, manufacturers are going to have to recalibrate their sensors to pick this up more sensibly.
Yeah, so this braking system, because I've driven cars when they were first bringing in that sort of automatic brake thing, and I remember driving, I think it was a Jag, that you could set it to 1, 2 or 3, depending on how soon you wanted it to brake. So even if you were on the motorway, if you were behind a car, it would begin to brake. Is it that, or is it more of an emergency setup or a version of that?
No, it's moved. So what you're referring to is kind of basically keeping your speed at the same speed, but if you're coming up to a car in front, you slow down.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's being able to take your foot off, the first step in a kind of autonomous driving. What this is emergency autonomous braking.
Got it.
So if something pops up in your way, you may not detect it, the brakes go on, and the car will apply the brakes. It may be very sudden to avoid an imminent crash. At other times, it may slow it down. I found it extremely useful, and I think most drivers do. But clearly, further work needs to go into this. And given that it's not all firms, but certain firms, and some sort of sharing of good practice, I think, is going to have to be needed here.
Yeah, I was surprised, of all things, that it might not. I was. If this report had said, unfortunately, the system fails to recognise bumpers on other cars, I'd have been similarly surprised. I mean, a high-vis jacket, clearly a symbol of safety and the ability to be spotted and seen. Look, clearly there are different systems that will do different things, but that will be troubling to parts of the auto industry.
Yes, it will.
That's back to the drawing board, isn't it?
Yeah, or it may mean a recalibration of the sensors. So various types of sensors used on these. It could be, lasers, radar, light sensors. Now, a high-vis jacket we can see with our human eyes, but a sensor may not see it very easily. So they're certainly going to have to look at that again.
Yeah, absolutely. And also this story as well, while you're with us, David, worth having a quick chat on this. A new study has warned that dust from vital car components is more toxic than fumes created by a diesel car. Apparently the problem is more significant in electric vehicles. So there's often some criticism of electric vehicles. Often people criticise the weight of them as being, troubling if the argument is about environmental considerations and other issues around braking as well. But this would be, surely one would assume, bearing in mind we're living in the net zero era, this would be troubling for the industry if the very components of the car are proving to be more toxic than diesel fuel.
I think what's really interesting about this research is a kind of wake-up call to the fact that you're never going to have a car that doesn't emit any pollution. And even if you eliminate the tailpipe, which an electric car does, you're still going to be getting particulates, very fine particles that can get into your lungs potentially from braking and also the tyres on the road. So I think that's a great piece of research. Where I take issue with it is kind of looking forwards and saying, well, that's likely to get worse under EVs because they're heavier. In fact, most EVs don't actually brake as much because they use the car to slow down, put the energy back into the battery. So I'm not convinced on that side of it. And actually, EVs are still a big step forward in terms of reducing pollution.
Yeah. When do we get to the stage, David, where there's no such thing as a crash?
Well, that's a really interesting point. So as the autonomous technology develops, we're going to go through various stages. You've talked about one stage already where you can take your foot off. Here you've got cruise control. The next step, which the government is legislating for, is to take your hands off at certain speeds on a motorway. As the technology develops, we'll be able to take our eyes off and then finally our brain. My wife says I drive my brain off already, but she doesn't mean we're fully autonomous. So that's going to take stages, and as cars autonomous features develop more and more, that will be more avoidable in the future.
We will watch with interest, that's for sure. And we will speak again, David. Great to have you on with us, sir. Thank you. David Bailey is Professor of Business Economics at the Birmingham Business School. It's a whole different, our forefathers who put together the humble motor car back in the day would be jaw-dropped at the thought of what a car does today. Some of it is great, there's bits of it that aren't so great, but I think the one thing everybody would agree on is there will be a point when no cars crash, right? There's got to be, because it will be impossible to have a crash because everything's censored up to the max and every car does the same thing. So regardless of the speed you're doing, you won't be able to override speed in certain areas. Your car will not let you do that. There'll be no speeding because your car won't let you do that. And there'll absolutely be no chance of banging into someone because your car won't let you do that. So what's not to like? What's not to like? You could, if you're a real petrol head, you might go, well, do you know what? I quite like driving a car. I like driving a car. I like the idea that I change the gears. I put my foot on the accelerator. I have to be aware of what's around me so that I can brake if I need to brake. I quite like that. But, you know, that's changing. There's no way around that. No way around that at all. More comment coming in from you. David says, essentially, we're being taxed by the BBC for showing Hamas propaganda in our homes. Can we get one of our judges to look at it if they're not busy looking at 23-year-old teenagers? Says David. It's a very good point. This one from Alan. Watching all the political class come out to slam Donald Trump's efforts when most can't tell you what a woman is. What a joke. Is that the third time I've tried to read that one? I think it is. Well done, Alan. You came out with a great comment. I keep reading it. This one in from Mike T. This appeasement of Putin is the same as the run-up to World War II. No one said anything about the Sudetenland. Is it Sudetenland? I thought. No one said anything about Czechoslovakia when Poland was divided by Germany and Russia was mobilised. Ukraine's appeasement is the precursor. Putin will use it to take the Baltic states. Europe has around 2 to 3 years to prepare and rearm. Then it's war. And that is the bit that Trump thinks he can solve. He can get that agreement without any of that potentially happening. Pav is in Harrow. How you doing, Pav?
Good afternoon. It's probably incumbent on me just to point out from a historical basis that the person, I only heard the back end of it, who was making the rather mendacious claims with the Sudetenland. Bear in mind that the Gallup polls we have from January 1939, the British public was overwhelmingly with the approach of the then Prime Minister. And it wasn't until the latter part of 1939, just so we set the historical record straight, that public opinion shifted when invariably the then dictator did what he did. So it just needs to be put into a bit of historical perspective, because often with the 30s, Ian, we get people cherry picking. Unfortunately, most of them don't have historic qualifications, but we'll leave that to a side. Wasn't what I rang you for.
Indeed. Yes, that's all right. That's another debate for another day.
Yeah. Well, let me start with, the main bit I wanted to ring you about was the kiss thing. We'll get on to that in a second. But with the Trump stuff, look, I at the end of the day, you know me, I'm sort of quite ambivalent about Trump. There's some things which I think Doge and stuff he's done extremely well. It's exactly what he got a mandate for. There's other stuff when I think that the narcissist that he is puts his foot firmly in his mouth. However, big however, I frankly am sick and tired, and I did this with a call on you last week, with the whole approach towards Zelensky, this deification of this guy. Now, the last time I checked, Ukraine isn't the first country ever to be invaded, nor will it be the last. True. Nor is he the next Messiah, as we would have us believe. And I think it's a very Eurocentric approach, Ian. There's this ridiculous notion, we see it in our media, not so much on your station, but elsewhere. The world is within, the world respects him. No, they don't. How many Indian and Chinese people have they turned around and spoken to? How many American people have they spoken to? How many people from South America have they spoken to? The answer is, and the reality is, it's very much this Eurocentric approach. A lot of these guys think that we're still in the 1950s, where Europe was the centerpiece of the world. They make these ridiculous assertions. And the bottom line is this with him, Ian. To me, and I've just got bad vibes about this guy, I'll be honest with you. If you asked me to give you something tangible, maybe I could or couldn't. But, you know, you look at his conduct, right? And people have been, again, comparing this today to Churchill. Well, we had national governments from 1931. It wasn't arbitrary decisions made by a prime minister. Whereas with this guy, opposition banning, people need to look at what he's been doing to Poroshenko through the courts over the last few days. You look at the fact that he closed some churches. You look at the fact that today, from all accounts, and I stress this isn't proven, he seems to have banned Trump's Truth Social platform within Ukraine, because you can't seem to access it there. That's what I've been hearing from very credible sources. It's hardly, tangible democracy at work. And then, of course, you throw in stuff what Azov have been doing. It's a very repressive regime. And people need to remember, and I've said this, in some space in the last few days, The Guardian were about to publish a hit piece on this guy, substantially linked to the way his money in Paradise, the Paradise scam had augmented, but they declined to do so because obviously the invasion took place. Now, and this is the other problem, this binary idea that if you say Zelensky's bad, you're endorsing Putin. No, not at all. You can do both.
You can, but that's the way it happens, isn't it? If you don't like Trump, somebody said, well, you must be a fan of Biden. And it's like, well, no, Ron DeSantis, actually. I mean, you can't... We live in that strange binary world, don't we?
We do, but we also live in that hypocrisy-laden world where, Mr. Collins, you'll recall, and I remember calling you in October, some of the very same people basically getting apoplectic, all about Trump's comments, and I don't think he did say what they said, but let's just for argument's sake for a second say he did, were the very ones calling Trump Hitler and Stalin but 3 months ago. So they need to take a look in the mirror as always. But anyway, on to the broader point that I rang you in at. This whole... I frankly find myself wanting to smash my head repeatedly and profusely against as many brick walls as I can, because I just don't know where we are in society. My take on this is quite simple. I followed this relatively closely, not meticulously. At the end of the day, to me, we are in a world now where, thankfully, on a lot of instances, we're getting to a stage where historic sexual assault victims, rape victims, and everything in between those particular parameters are thankfully getting justice as best they can. Obviously, if someone's deceased, it's more difficult to do. However, I do think that cases like this, to me, almost make a mockery of some of the things that those people no doubt will go through and do go through because, frankly, they haven't received justice. Because let's put this into perspective. If this was a sustained campaign, right, we have criminal laws. When I say we, most of Western Europe, and this took place in Spain, so it wasn't a million miles away. We have laws in place to ensure that this sort of conduct is dealt with if it's serious in terms of from a criminal perspective. If not, then it's dealt with either morally or indeed at work where someone would be sanctioned, removed, etc. Right? There's no doubt about it, and I can't imagine anybody suggesting otherwise. However, there does need to be, and I always say to people, the two things that modern world lacks is nuance and context. And the context here, in my opinion, is very key. So, for example, it was a moment of jubilation. Now, I'm not saying that excuses that, but let's put it the other way, just to play counterfactual games for a moment. If the head of the Spanish Football Federation was a woman and she'd planted that onto a male player, would the potential ramification of it been as broad as it was? I'll leave people to draw that in conclusion inference itself. But the bottom line is, at the time, the Spanish women were all about, and you saw this by their website and some of their pronouncements before the tournament, were determined to try to, what they say, balance out toxic masculinity. They were looking for equal pay and everything else. So naturally, they had this situation, and it was politicized. I mean, Hermoso's, they claimed that she couldn't enjoy the moment and everything else. I mean, okay, look, we have to be careful because different people, react differently.
Sure.
But for goodness sake, you turn around, you say to yourself, he should have offered an apology. He should have turned around and said, look, I got carried away in the moment. It was wholly inappropriate. Yeah. And if they had sanctioned him, fine. But criminal conduct for kissing. What next, Mr. Collins? If I ever meet you, I hug you, and then you say, oh, that pal from Harrow hugged me.
You'd be straight in the High Court.
Well,
yeah.
There you go. And then you'd lose one of your regular listeners.
Getting one of those iffy lawyers on the case. You'd be in Pentonville by 6 o'clock, Pav. There's no way around it. Listen, always a great call, Pav, in Harrow. Thank you for that. 0344 499 1000. Peter Carwell is on drive. We'll chat to Peter in just a couple of moments and find out what is going on the Drive Time Show. It's going to be a busy one for sure. All of that coming up in just a couple of moments. It's 10 to 4. This is Talk. Trump is being classic Trump when he says to Zelensky, "You started it." I don't think he did, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, they're
pushing it a bit there. But if talking must be good, surely. I mean, aiming for peace is better than endlessly fighting that grotesque war in which hundreds of thousands of young men are dying in horrific circumstances day after day.
This is Talk. Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk coming up on 5 to 4. Let's get a word from Steve in Leeds. How you doing, Steve?
I'm good, Ian. How are you?
I'm very good. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Just a couple of quick points. One about Starmer and Trump, and one about why the war in Ukraine was helped to start. First one, Trump should turn around to Europe and say, if you're happy for us to continue this war, you pay for it. Yep. You buy the weapons off us and you supply them, but we're not paying any more because it's nothing to do with us. And you'd find all those politicians in Europe, but, oh, no, we can't. So it's not fair to ask the American people to pay for a war that's in Western Europe.
When a war is against Russia, though, does that become America's concern and part problem?
No, because Russia isn't starting a world war, it's starting a local war, and we all know why. Second point, Starmer. Starmer needs to talk to Tony Blair and ask him what it takes to be a statesman, because Tony Blair had to make some very unpleasant choices to resolve the conflict in Northern Ireland. But as a statesman, he did it. Nobody was happy with the full extent of the deal he did with the IRA, but it brought peace for 20 years.
Yep.
And I don't think Starmer's got the wherewithal as a statesman to understand that there is no winner in a compromise agreement to stop killing. But at the end of the day, if he stops the killing, that's what you've got to do. My last point, Ian, was I think Europe's responsible in part for this war in Ukraine because we allowed ourselves to become so dependent on Russian energy and Russian oligarchs. That gave Putin a bargaining chip when the war started that slowed the Europeans down from fully supporting Ukraine. So Germany and France and all those countries that wanted the cheap energy to meet the climate change targets made Putin more bold in his choices about starting a war. Yeah. Because he had him over a barrel, didn't he? Look at what happened when he started.
It's absolutely spot on. It's going to be anything but dull, isn't it, Steve? Thank you very much indeed, Steve in Leeds. And I don't think there's anybody who doesn't want this to end, peacefully, and for there to be amicable kind of agreements all round. You've seriously got to question. Bearing in mind, Putin is a man who would rather have been in charge of the USSR than Russia. And it's no secret that expansionism is part of the plan. So where's he going to go then after this? Will he go back in his box because Donald Trump told him to? No more tinkering around any other bits of territory, Vlad? Is he going to do that? Bit of breaking news. The former head of Spain's Football Federation, Rubiales, is going to appeal the ruling made earlier today, which found him guilty of kissing the player, the Spanish player Jenny Hermoso, without consent. This was following the Women's World Cup win back in 1923. It was an extraordinary moment. It wasn't really extraordinary at the time. I don't think. Maybe it was to Ms. Hermoso. But I think to most people at the time, in that very fleeting moment, it was a display of jubilation. I don't think anybody would have gone, oh my God, I've just witnessed a sexual assault on television. As it turned out, Mr. Rubiales was not found guilty of sexual assault and coercion, I think the phrase was, but he was found guilty of the kiss, as it were. And it does depend on where you're sat. So if you are her, you may well be a bit racked off about the whole thing. But if you're not her, then I think it's, reasonable to suggest that there could be more than one interpretation of this. Now, if she feels uncomfortable, the way it goes, he's not entitled to have his own views on what he thinks is the case. He can't do that. He has to roll over and go, fine. I kind of understand that, but then is there no objectivity in this where somebody could say, not desirable, we wouldn't advise it, but we can see in the heat of the moment why that happened. It clearly wasn't sexual. It was about jubilation and nothing more than that. So, and if it was the other way round, I know it's not quite an equivalence, but if it was the other way round, we wouldn't be in any of this discussion. Peter Cardwell, hello.
Hello, Ian. How are you doing?
I've never, ever, I mean, we've had a little man hug, I'm sure, from time to time. I've never gone in for a kiss.
You haven't so far?
So far.
Could today be the day?
Not even a slight pinch. But I've never, I mean, it is interesting that the context of that is key, right? I mean, this is almost a Netflix show. Like The Staircase, you know, but did he do it? Did he not do it?
But it's hard to know with people because I don't like people hugging me who've just met me. I go for a handshake first, and then if you get on with the person, I'm quite a big hugger, but if I've just met the person, I'll happily have a handshake.
It is a bit weird.
It is a bit weird, like someone you've just met gives you a hug. It seems to me to be insincere.
Yeah.
And it's been a while since anybody I've just met kissed me, but it's a strange thing, and we're all navigating these kind of rules. But also, if someone specifically says, I mean, I have a sort of a goddaughter, actually, my friend's daughter, who is just not a hugger. She's just like,
some people don't.
Please don't hug me. You know, that's fine. We do a little fist bump or we high five or whatever. That's okay.
But people do kiss. I just literally during the break, I kissed a baby in this building as I ran out to go to the loo. I bumped into Catherine, former producer of